Hey guys, welcome to Fanfic Fanatics. So in today's video we are gonna see, what if Deku became Beast of Woods and fell in love with Mina? Part 4. Before starting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you are interested in MHA fanfictions. This story is Beast in the Woods by Big Teddy 3498. Now without wasting any more time, let's dive in. Kirishima was launched back once again and he got up again. He was huffing and puffing as he stared down his opponent, who seemed right as rain. Izuku grinned back as he let the other team catch his breath. The two have been sparring for the past half hour in an attempt to help Kirishima try something new with his quirk. The redhead had come up to Izuku and asked him to help him out since they both had transforming quirks. The feral boy was more than happy to help. The only thing was Kirishima was a fist fighter at heart and Izuku was feral animal. Growing up in the forest, ingrained in a fighting style in Izuku similar to wolves, he weaved in and out of attack range while hitting weaknesses. Kirishima threw a punch and Izuku ducked under his arm to jab at his side and kick his knee. Kirishima tried to grapple and Izuku dodged back and then pounced on the boy when he was off balance. Izuku also wasn't scared to use underhanded tactics such as throwing rubble at Kirishima's eyes or attacking while he was down. "Ready, Shima?" Izuku asked with a grin. His knuckles were ready at his sides. His flesh was pulled back and hardened steel bones were open to the air. "How? Are you not tired?" Shima asked in between breaths. Izuku shrugged. "I don't know. I think I need a break." Shima knelt where he was across from Izuku. "Thanks for the help. I think I have a good idea of where to go from here." The redhead beamed at his classmate. Izuku beamed back. "All right, see you later," he said with a wave. As he walked away, he sniffed the air and looked to the entrance of the gym to see one bee stretching along the walls. Aizawa and Vlad were chatting not far from them. He brightened at seeing them and ran over to greet his friends. Monoma saw him and smiled in greeting. "Izuku. It's good to see you well." The copycat trailed off at seeing his almost regenerated arm. "I heard of your injury, how is it?" Izuku tilted his head in confusion. "Injury?" Monoma motioned to his arm and he looked at it. "Ooh," he said in understanding. "It's fine, I'm almost done, it doesn't hurt or anything," he said with a shrug. Monoma smiled at his cavalier attitude towards his missing limb. Kendo approached from the side to join in the conversation. "Izuku? I never got the chance to thank you for helping my class back to camp. So, thank you." She bowed towards him and straightened with a smile. Izuku smiled back proudly. "I was happy to help." "How is your training?" Monoma asked. "It's a bit tricky for me since my quirk is dependent on who is around me at the time," he said with a sigh. "Great, I can fly now," Izuku said, preening at the surprised looks on their faces. "Wanna see?" "Very much so," Monoma said and Kendo nodded in interest. Izuku backed off and took off his shirt in front of everyone. There were many surprise noises and a few wolf whistles. He didn't notice the few covering their eyes with red faces or the drooling face of Tokage. He focused on his wings and they burst out his shoulder blades. He stretched them out and grinned back at one bee. "Oh God, he can fly," Vlad said from the side. "That's very intimidating and incredible," Monoma said in awe of the wingspan. "Thanks." Izuku beamed and folded his wings to his back. He tilted his head at hearing Kachan's voice and he turned around. "Oh! Stop stripping in front of everyone, you damn exhibitionist," Kachan yelled from atop a concrete cliff. "Don't say bad words, and I have too. I don't want to tear my clothes. Also, what's an exhibitionist?" Izuku yelled back. "Don't tell me what to do. Go to the support department to get it fixed," Kachan yelled in return, purposefully ignoring the last question. "Stop yelling or you both have detention," Aizawa yelled, glaring at the two. "The support department is where our stuff gets made for hero work. Like our costumes, items, and such. They probably can help you with that," Kendo explained. "That seems handy. Where is it?" "I don't mind showing you," Tokage said, arriving at Izuku's side. She was grinning and showing off all her shark-like teeth. "You can call me Set." "Away with you, harlot." Mina arrived at Izuku's side and pushed Tokage's face away. The head detached and the body remained. "He's taken," she hissed at the floating head. Izuku peered into the open neck to see a black slate where her blood and tissue should have been. Quirks are weird. he said, still looking in curiosity. His second pair of eyes opened to give him a different view. His mantis shrimp eyes didn't see anything other than black like his normal eyes did. Like you should be talking. Tokage snorted and motioned to his horns, legs, forearm composed of tendrils, and large wings. Izuku looked down at himself and then at his wings. He flapped slightly. He looked confused. "What's wrong with how I look?" said the walking apocalypse, waiting to snap. "Don't listen to her. She's just jealous she can't have you," Mina said primly and walked off with Izuku's arm hooked with hers. She turned to stick her tongue at the floating head one last time. "What was that about?" Kendo asked, confused at the normally friendly Pink girl's behavior. "Pinky has been possessive of the nerd ever since they got back from their date over the weekend. He took her out for her birthday and then they came back with her clinging to him like he was going off to war the next day," Kachan said near them. He crossed his arms and stared at the two leaving and heading to the support department. "My guess is some girl got too friendly with the animal and he obviously didn't know and she got jealous," he shrugged. Monoma pursed his lips and slowly nodded. "I can see that happening." "It'll pass, probably." Kachan shrugged and followed the two mates to change and head for the dorms. Izuku eyed his mate cautiously. He was sure she wouldn't get angry at him, but he didn't like seeing her like she was at the moment. "Are you still angry at that girl? From our date?" he asked carefully. "I get that she recognized you from the sports festival, but to suddenly jump on you, the nerve. And it wasn't just some excited hopping, but she pounced on top of you. If I wasn't trying to get my hero licenses." She said the last part with quiet anger. She gripped his arm tighter. Izuku nodded along with her rant. At the time he was so surprised that a random girl their age had leapt on him with no ill intentions that he simply fell with her on top of him. The random girl began to take dozens of pictures with her leaning on him in the middle of the park the two UA students had been walking through. Mina was extremely caught off guard and didn't react immediately. It was only when Izuku began to try to push the girl off of him that Mina acted and helped. More through the girl off of Izuku. It turned out she had an animalistic quirk related to a dog, and his presence had changed to something loving with his time with Mina unknowingly, and her admiration of Izuku from the sports festival compounded with that. Izuku pulled his arm from Mina's and pulled her into a hug. "I only want you as my mate," he said simply to put her at ease. Mina was startled slightly at the hug since she was the one to initiate them, but she hugged him back. She melted at the words he said and she buried her face in the crook of his neck with a blush. "How is it you can always make me blush?" "Because I'm your mate," he said beaming. "I swear Namori is feeding you lines," she mumbled. Izuku tilted his head in confusion. "Feeding me lines? What kind of food is that?" Mina pinched his cheeks with both hands. "You are so precious. Come on, let's go to the support department. I'm sure they could fix your clothes problem." She let go of his cheeks and moved her hand away from a half-handed attempt to bite it. Izuku smiled at her and moved his wing to hug her. She laughed at the large appendage wrapping around her before it retracted and the wings were sucked back into his body. He put on his shirt again and they made their way to the support department. The two arrived at the blast door and Izuku frowned at it as he sniffed the air. He sneezed at the overwhelming odor of oil, burning metals, and other things he couldn't put a finger on. Mina giggled at his kitten sneeze and moved to open the door. She backed away when a large plume of black acrid smoke bellowed out. Izuku's senses practically shut down to save them from the black miasma. Mina waved her hand in front of her face to save her lungs while backing away. Power Loader stumbled out coughing so harshly you'd think he was trying to eject a lung on purpose. He quickly began to push buttons on his wrist device as soon as he could breathe normally. Loud fans started up and all the toxic air was sucked into the vents around the room. "Hatsume. If you are going to test something, use the chambers. That's what they're there for," he shouted into the room where a pink-haired girl with an advanced gas mask was covering her face. She stood up from what was her experiment and removed the mask to make notes on what she saw more carefully. She didn't pay attention to the teacher yelling at her or the two others behind him. "Loader. This is where you work. Is it always so smelly?" Izuku looked around at the room with dozens of devices he couldn't name to save his life. Power Loader looked at him. "Oh, Izuku. Yes, welcome to my department. What brings you here?" "Customers." Hatsume jerked up from what she was doing and quickly approached. Izuku didn't let her get closer than an arm's length so his mate wouldn't get upset again. Tendrils extended from his hand and wrapped around her waist before she got too close. My clothes keeps ripping when I do things. Like I can grow wings, but I don't want to rip my shirt. Can you do something about it? He didn't pay attention to the girl trying to escape his tendrils. Power Loader looked at Hatsume and then Izuku and then Mina, who looked too satisfied. He brushed it all off and focused on Izuku. We could do a few things. Izuku felt a shock that traveled up the tendrils to his arm and into his very conductive bones. He yelped and released Hatsume from her confines. I've got the baby just for you. Introducing my personal favorite, Jetpack version 2.8. She held up a metal backpack with twin thrusters on the bottom. Never again will you have to worry about flying. Izuku recovered from his shock and reminded himself to work on something to prevent electricity from stunning him just like now. But I can already fly, he said confused. What about what Toru has? Mina asked Power Loader. Toru. The hero repeated to remember the name. He snapped his fingers and pointed at Mina. Hagakure, invisible, right? Yes, something like that would work. We would just need enough hair for the cloth. He nodded. How about a crossbow with multiple variants of ammunition? I've got smoke, explosives, electricity, and even expanding foam. Although, I don't recommend skin contact with the foam unless you. Anyways. Anything catch your fancy? Hatsume rambled on and showed off things she made to Izuku, who eyed the crossbow. I can do that, Izuku mumbled in thought. He hummed with pursed lips and extended his arm where the arms of a crossbow grew, and then tendrils connected a line of sinew for the line. A deadly sharp bolt was loaded into it with the help of more tendrils. Once done, he twitched his finger and the bolt zipped through the air and embedded into the wall. Izuku's eyes shone with the new idea as he admired the crossbow that was fixed to the back of his forearm. We should have never let Snipe show him how to use firearms, Power Loader said quietly as he watched the whole thing happen. Cell-war manipulation? If I was more interested in the biological part of support items I would be all over you, but I'm not. Hatsume examined the crossbow on Izuku's arm and then shrugged. The feral boy's thoughts raced as he began to get new ideas about his newest weapon and how he could put it to use. He was brought out of his thoughts when his mate poked his cheek. He turned to her with his usual smile and she motioned to Power Loader with a smile. Power Loader was smirking at Izuku. We're gonna need a lot of your hair for what I have planned. He held out a bag to Izuku. Tendrils grabbed it and held it open. How much? He looked up. Fill it up if you can. How do those things work again? Izuku mumbled to himself as a tendril snaked inside the bag, and then green and black hair began to grow rapidly from the tendril. Quickly enough, the bag was filled, and then the hairs on the tendril fell on their own. He closed the bag and handed it to Power Loader. That was creepy, Mina said. Not the weirdest thing I've seen. Power Loader said, taking the bag. Give us a bit and your new costume will be ready and you won't have to worry about going nude to use your quirk. He barked out a laugh. The two mates arrived back at the dorms out of their costumes. It was getting dark as they opened the doors. The girls of 1A were chatting to the side and Mina quickly went to join after kissing Izuku on the cheek. For his part, he wandered to the kitchen for a snack, more specifically a lamb stick. Many of the guys were in the kitchen cooking up their meals for dinner. Izuku weaved through them all to get to his lamb stick and then out the back door, avoiding the chaos in the kitchen. Izuku arrived at his den with a few rodents he caught on the way. With practiced movements, he lit the fire, skinned and dressed the food, and finally sat down to snack on the lamb while the rodents got cooked. His tendrils snaked into his den and grabbed one of his books and a bottle of iron supplements. He felt something dig into his tendril as he pulled it out. He held his tendril in front of him with the Bengal cat dangling from it. She saw it was him and let go to land softly on the ground. Izuku frowned at the cat who had invaded his den. The cat looked up at him and chirped before darting into his den again. He began to feel indignant at the nerve of the cat sleeping in his den, but paused when the cat came back with a dead badger. She slowly dragged it out of his den and finally dropped it in front of the owner of the territory. She chirped at him and placed a paw on the badger before backing away. He watched the cat in curiosity. This is for me? Your payment to live here? He asked the cat. The cat chirped once more in the firelight. Izuku looked down at the badger larger than the cat and then at the cat who waited patiently for his response. Very well, you can stay in my den. Before the cat could begin to purr in success, Izuku spoke again. But, you will not touch my trophies or I will eat you. he threatened. The cat had her ears flattened against her head at the sudden declaration but rolled over to show her belly to him in supplication of his order. She meowed loudly before getting up and lying down close to the warmth of the fire to nap. About a week later, Izuku and the pack of 1A got off the bus to the testing location. He was the last off, making sure everyone was accounted for, and he looked around at the new scents and people close to their age. Just from a glance, he could see many new animalistic quirks he had never seen yet. He hummed in anticipation at the challenge he could feel ahead. He releases a pulse of his presence for everyone to feel. Hundreds of animal quirk users stiffened up at the sense they got for that split second. A top hunter had arrived in their midst for a challenge. They could almost taste the words written in the air. Were they worthy of being a trophy? The class caught the two animal quirks stiffen up just like the other hundreds had. They turned to Izuku, who was smiling lazily as he watched the crowds of students. "All right. I don't know what you're doing, but that's enough." Mina pulled him along and he naturally went along with her request. Aizawa lazily glared at Izuku but continued. "This is where you'll go inside, change, and then take the exam. Don't disappoint me or got it?" Aizawa looked over the class. "Good enough. Now, Zawa." "Who's that? She seems like she is speeding up." He was about to glare at Izuku for interrupting him but paused to look over his shoulder. He let out a long sigh as he prayed for strength. "Aizawa. Long time no see. Let's get married." The hero pulled Aizawa into a side hug. Mina squealed in excitement at the idea of marriage, but Aizawa cut it off at the root. "No." Aizawa pushed the green-haired woman off of him. "Class, this is Ms. Joke, an underground hero like me." "You two seem close," Tsuyu said, already recovered from Izuku's intense presence. "Our agencies were close and we worked together a lot of the time, but I'm here just like he is. Meet my class. From Ketsubutsu Academy High School." Ms. Joke motioned to a group of gray uniformed students. The lead held out a hand to Kachan first. "It's nice to meet the class that persevered so much this year." Kachan didn't take the hand and eyed him with some disgust. Izuku got close just as Kirishima was about to reprimand Kachan for the rude action. The feral boy sniffed the air and looked at the boy who was smiling oddly. "You smell like lies and fakeness." "Kachan. What's that one word? With fake and lies?" He turned from the startled boy to the blonde. "Deceit," Kachan said bluntly. Izuku pointed at Kachan and nodded his head. "You smell of deceitness." He pointed at the boy. "That's not a word, you animal." Kachan yelled at his friend and slapped his pointing hand down. "And stop pointing, you look weird." "It is a word. I made it." Izuku slapped Kachan's arm in retribution for his slapped hand. Kachan reeled in pain from the metal-enhanced slap and put his old friend in a headlock. "You can't make words up." "Then how were words made?" Izuku grunted out as his air was cut off. Kachan didn't have anything to say to that and froze as he tried to think of a comeback. He let go of Izuku as he felt a tongue on his arm slide up and down. "What are you? 5. He pulled his arm away and used Izuku's uniform to dry off the wet spot from his saliva. "And this is my class," Aizawa said dryly. "Hey, Roki?" Todoroki didn't turn. "Roki, Roki." Izuku poked him twice in the shoulder to get his attention and he turned to the feral boy. He looked slightly confused. "That's not my name. Why do you call me that?" Izuku shrugged. "It's less of a mouthful. Everyone has such long names and I think it's better if they're short, like how Mina calls me, Zu. Plus, I always call my friends with short names." He finished with a beaming smile. "Oh, okay then. I like it." Roki smiled slightly at the shorter boy. "Good. Anyways, what's with that guy who was glaring at you? The really tall bald guy?" Izuku held his hand above his head to show the height. "He was at the recommendation entrance exams and placed first. He chose to go to another school instead. I believe it was because of me. I was much more difficult than I am now," Roki said by explanation as he changed in the locker room with the rest of Class 1A's boys. Izuku nodded along as he listened. He shrugged and put on some pants finally. "Maybe we'll fight him," he said eagerly. "What's the recommendation entrance exams?" "You're joking." Kachan gave him a flat look and then shook his head. "Of course, you're not joking, why would you?" Izuku stuck his tongue out at him and listened as Roki explained. "Every hero has one recommendation they can put for a hero school. My father recommended me. Our exam was a race with many obstacles in our way to the finish line. He finished putting his suit on and turned to their pack leader. Oh, right. Your dad is some hero, I forgot. Roki smirked at that. Yes, just some hero, he said with too much mirth. Would you hurry the fuck up, it's like you like being naked all the time, Kachan yelled at his old friend. Izuku held up a finger and wagged it at him. I'ma tell Aunt Suki you are saying bad words, he said seriously, and then he shrugged. I mean, it doesn't bother me, I guess. We could tell, Toshi said dryly. The boys grouped up with the girls and headed to the gathering room for all the examinees. Hundreds of people gathered in the large room, all with their unique quirks and colorful costumes. Izuku purposefully kept his senses dulled to avoid an overload of information. They all waited until a tired-looking man walked onto the podium. Izuku tried to pay attention, but his voice was very monotonous and caused his attention to drift around. He snapped back to attention when there was an uproar all around him. What happened? Izuku asked his pack. Only 100 of us will pass out of the 1500, Kaminari whined. Oh, then make sure you pass then, Izuku said as it was obvious. His pack all gave him wry grins at his attitude and then nodded to each other with resolve to pass the exam. Officials came around to pass the targets out to everyone. Izuku was again confused but followed suit when his packmates began to put them on their bodies. He shrugged once again and placed one above his heart and one on each side of his torso. Once some time had passed and everyone had targets on their bodies, the room rumbled and split open. A massive arena was shown with more than enough space for everyone to find a good place to fight. That's what everyone did, they split up. Izuku's mouth began to water at the idea of so many things to hunt. He leapt in front of everyone. Have a good hunt, and turned to sprint to the wooded area he spotted immediately. Wait. You are leaving? Yaoyorozu asked. She saw Mina not looking surprised but looked even more resolved than most to pass the exam. I can pass and help you pass, but I won't. I will always protect my pack, but my pack needs to fight for themselves too, he said seriously, then he beamed at all of them. You all will do good. Then he sprinted off. They were quiet for a short moment before Kirishima spoke first. He's right. He helped everyone back at the summer camp, but that doesn't mean we are reliant on Izuku. Let's all pass and show everyone we can take on anyone. The pack cheered and began to make plans and group up with each other. Even Kachan and Todoroki stayed after Izuku had said what he wanted to say. With Yaoyorozu, the three of them led their group to pass the exam. The hunter sprinted over the arena to the wooded area. He was grinning from ear to ear in anticipation of the hunt ahead. He heard footfalls near him and turned to see others doing the same as he was. There were many kinds of people near him, from animalistic quirk users to plant quirks. The hunter turned back to the woods before him and laughed with glee at the upcoming event. Many of those who followed faltered at hearing such a laugh, but many more scorned his attitude of being outnumbered by other schools. They tried to follow him to corner him when the exam started, but no one could find him, not by scent, sound, or line of sight. While the UA crushing was always targeted at their class as a whole, examinees often singled out a singular UA student, and none more than the winner of the sports festival and the boy who took out Stain the hero killer. While they searched where the lone boy went, the hunter already picked out his hunt. The hunter leapt from one tree branch to another with only the slightest rustling of leaves. His breathing was shallow and his eyes narrowed on his prey. A big examinee with black fur covering almost his whole body except his face and large hands. The hunter didn't know which school he belonged to, but he didn't care. The gorilla quirk user stomped on the ground with each footfall propelled by his large muscular arms. He stopped and sniffed the air only to snort and continue looking for another examinee to eliminate. He didn't get far as the hunter dropped onto his back and slammed a hammer fist on his massive shoulder. The gorilla stumbled forward with a grunt of pain and whipped his arms around to counterattack whoever ambushed him, but he only hit air. The fair sound of breaking twigs alerted him to the side, but the pain blossomed in his side. A fist dug into his ribs. With a roar of anger, he slammed his fists down on the ground, which shook the area. His opponent was finally revealed to be a small green-haired boy with horns and wolf legs. What caused him to pause were the eyes. The boy had eyes only a feral animal would have. Therein his eyes shone a predator, and his wide smile only enhanced his thoughts. Only a coward would attack another in such a way. The gorilla huffed out. I wasn't aware Ua had stooped so low, he baited the wild boy. The hunter tilted his head in confusion. But I'm a hunter, that's what I do. He stated it as it was obvious. He snorted a derisive laugh. A hunter? I only see a tiny weak boy. He charged and raised his fists into a double slam on the green boy. He didn't move and took the impact with his raised arms to block. A massive boom shook the area. The gorilla was horrified to see the boy still standing and smiling even wider. Quick as his eye could see, the boy used his arms as a lever to flip the massive gorilla examinee over his head to smash into the dirt ground. The wind was knocked out of him and it was driven out again as the small but dense green-haired boy pounced on his chest. With the sound of grinding bones, claws extended from his hand and stopped right before the hairy throat. The gorilla froze at the implicated threat. Izuku pursed his lips in dissatisfaction. You need to be less restrained. I can imagine growing up everyone told you to be careful with your strength, but in a fight? Izuku shook his head with a sigh and retracted his clawed hand from his throat to the relief of the gorilla. I submit. The gorilla said morosely. Not a good hunt. Izuku got off his chest and on the way tore off an emblem from his uniform. He turned and left the gorilla stunned as he left the examinee still in the exam. He again disappeared into the trees to find another to hunt, but someone found him instead as a dozen quills shot through the leaves. He was hit 3 times and dodged a dozen more. He dropped from the trees onto the ground. He quickly ran through the trees as he continued to dodge the quills. He felt sluggish and looked at the quills. Some sort of poison. He quickly pulled them out and isolated the toxins before ejecting them from his body. He heard laughter from many others as he continued to weave through the trees to find a path of attack. He found who was shooting him quickly. A trio of boys worked together to pin down Izuku. One had the resemblances of a poison dart frog with greenish-yellow tinted skin, and the one shooting quills was a porcupine with quills shooting out of his arms. The frog boy smeared some liquid from his hands onto the quills and then the other shot them. The last boy was a bird-headed boy who looked kinda like Tokiyami but had an eagle head instead and wings for arms with hands at the end. Oh, it's one of the Ua brats. Yo, we found one. The eagle boy shouted in a shrill voice to the woods. There was a roar of excitement from deeper in the forest. Izuku could only get more excited at the sound of the roar. He grinned and dashed for the porcupine. He grabbed a fallen tree and hurled it at the trio to buy some time as he closed the distance. The 3 leapt away from the missile with the eagle taking to the air and the frog leaping onto a tree and sticking on its surface. The porcupine wasn't so lucky and was clipped on the side. He was sent sprawling on the ground with a hiss of pain. Izuku was on him in a flash, but he recovered fast as he shot more poison quills into Izuku's chest. He paid it no heed as he slammed his fist into the porcupine and then picked him up before throwing him bodily at the frog who was in midair in an attempt to help his classmate. They collided harshly and Izuku grinned savagely. There was a screech of an eagle as the third boy dove at Izuku. He dodged nimbly and avoided the razor talons digging into the earth. Just as Izuku was going to go after the eagle, there was the sound of a running animal on all fours. Izuku instinctively dodged back multiple times and was rewarded by only getting clawed once in the chest. Izuku took in the new arrival with eagerness. He could be only described as a werewolf. Almost 7 feet tall with long arms for running on all fours. His hands were tipped in razor claws, one stained red with Izuku's blood. He had gray fur all over his body including his muzzle which sported vicious teeth. So this is the lone pup of Ua. The werewolf growled out with mirth. He sniffed the blood on his claws and snorted. It should be an easy fight. My paralytic poison should be taking its toll by now, Frog Boy said smugly. More and more arrived to surround the lone Ua student. All with the same uniform, most with some kind of animal quirk. They circled the leader of their class and his supposed prey. You should have stayed in your territory, pup. You were in the woods and in the woods I am king. He roared and the others circling Izuku cheered. Izuku took it all in with a smile on his face. His teeth could be seen by everyone. The others thought he had snapped and was in despair of being outnumbered, but Izuku was just excited. No, you're not. I am, Izuku said as he pulled the quills from his stomach and chest. The werewolf was quiet for a moment before barking out a harsh laugh. All you Ua brats think they are the best, typical, he said with a sneer of derision. I've hunted many things. Rabbits, badgers, deer. He eyed each animal quirk user that matched with what he said, all while smiling. A bear, even a shark. But I've killed plenty of wolves. His teeth began to sharpen as he locked eyes with the werewolf. The green-haired boy's clawed chest knit closed before everyone's eyes. You say you are the king of the woods, but I earned the title. The new costume followed suit and knit closed at his command. The hunter shifted into his true form. Bones cracked and skin tore as his body changed. His lips were pulled back and his teeth grew interlocked. Bone plates covered the vulnerable parts of his face. His arms lengthened with razor claws with one hand made of lashing tendrils. He grew taller than the werewolf. His bony tail with a spear tip coiled around the ground with clinking movement. The hunter took in the stillness of the clearing as he breathed in and his 4 eyes locked onto the werewolf who looked frightened. I am the king of the woods. A dozen voices pronounced. I am the beast of the woods. He roared with his presence unleashed. The whole woods felt it and collapsed to their knees in fear. All but one who defiantly stood his ground. He stared into the werewolf's shaken eyes and pointed his clawed hand at him. You will be a good hunt. And he pounced. The werewolf dove out of the way of the claws that rent the earth where he stood into a crater. He yelped in surprise and instinctively clawed back at the beast who was the boy. The beast dodged easily as his tail whipped around and slammed into his side to launch him across the clearing. He rolled and got onto all fours before frantically running around to the back of the beast. It was no use as the hunter caught up to him faster than he could see. In a flash, his neck was in the hunter's claws and he was lifted before being slammed through a tree that shattered on impact. The tree fell and so did the werewolf who stumbled on the ground dazed by the impact. He didn't give up and got back up to lash out with frenzy attacks at the hunter who dodged or blocked the attacks. The werewolf managed to see the tail whip around to strike him once more and dodged just in time, but the fist to his muzzle threw him onto his back. The werewolf didn't yield just yet and tried to bite the beast as he neared. It was futile as the only thing he managed was to be grappled by the clawed hand of the beast. His muzzle was held shut and the beast stared into his eyes in challenge. The werewolf growled but closed his eyes due to the combination of being overpowered so easily and the heavy weight of the constant presence aimed at him. He submitted to the true king of the woods. You did good, but I am better. The hunter stated as he grabbed the emblem on his uniform and tore it off. He pulled out the ball he took with him at the beginning of the exam and tapped it against each target. With that, he left the defeated werewolf on the ground and turned to see the circle of students shivering on their knees. He moved to the unconscious porcupine and did the same as the werewolf. His targets glowed green and his task was complete. Finally, he retracted his presence and everyone let out a shaky breath. Good luck to the rest of you. The hunter smiled, causing everyone to shiver. Massive wings exploded from his back and with one earth-shaking leap, he was airborne, leaving a shaken group of students. With somewhat practiced movements, he began to fly toward the big arrow. He guessed that was the way and began to glide over the examinees. He observed the fights going on with eagle-eye precision. He was fascinated by all the unique people and quirks. Up in the viewing stands, Aizawa and Ms. Joke caught sight of the massive wings and the figure under them. Aizawa let out a sigh through his nose and shook his head at the feral student of his. Damn. Would you look at the size of those wings? Who do you think they belong to? Ms. Joke turned to her seatmate who was a racerhead. Some brat, he said in his usually gruff voice. She snorted a laugh and turned back to see the winged figure stop in midair and turn in their direction. What are they doing? She mumbled. She pulled up the monocular she carried with her and looked through it to see something from a horror story looking back right at her and waving. Holy hell, she said slowly. He's waving, isn't he? Aizawa didn't move an inch but stared back at the figure in the air. She turned to him in surprise. How do you know? Like I said, it's some brat. He glared at the flying figure and they dove away with a laugh that could be heard even from so far away. Damn feral brat. He grumbled. Izuku swept through the air and caught sight of Kachan and some of his pack-mates finishing a fight. He grinned at their successful hunt and dove down to watch closer. There were 6 in his group with Kachan taking the lead in combat. Kaminari, Kirishima, Shiro, Shoji, and Ojiro fought around him. They were fighting on a faux highway against some students with nice hats and similar uniforms as to the big guy who glared at Roki. Izuku didn't interfere in their battle but did land heavily on the highway sign to watch. His wings folded on his back and his tail swung lazily like a cat as he loomed over them all. There were a few screams of fright at seeing his appearance, but none from his packmates. He perched on the sign and almost tilted off until he shifted his paws into bird talons that dug into the metal under him for support. He watched as Kachan danced around with his quirk. Precisely used it to get the most out of his movements while also getting the full power delivered to his opponent, who was a copy of Kirishima but made of the concrete he stood on. The mimic Kirishima was launched back against the guard rail and dented it as he landed. His body turned to the metal of the rail starting at his hand and traveled up his arm. He got back up with a tired grunt but was slammed back down after a devastating explosion straight to his head. "What are you doing, nerd?" Kachan turned from his downed opponent to his old friend. "I don't need any of your damn help." "Bad words, Kachan." Izuku chastised him with a dozen voices and a wag of his clawed fingers aimed at him. "But no, I just wanted to watch." He dropped down from the sign onto the concrete. It cracked at the impact and his weight. His talons shifted to paws again and he wandered around the battlefield. "You get your two?" Kaminari asked as he tapped the ball onto an unconscious examinee he fought. "Yep. I got 2 trophies too," he said with childish glee. He stooped down to pick up one of the Shiketsu uniform hats and looked at it. "This is mine now," he said with authority and placed it on his head. His messy curly hair slipped out the sides of the hat, but he hummed in contentment. "It suits you, Izuku," Shoji admitted. "The dark color goes well with your hair." "I gotta agree." Siro's helmet opened to nod appreciatively. Izuku shifted back to his normal self and beamed at them. "Thanks." "Should we really be taking their belongings like that?" Ojiro asked with apprehension. "The animal already took trophies, what's another?" Kachan shrugged. He turned to Izuku with a raised eyebrow. "What did you take?" Izuku proudly produced 2 patches with the same outline but different animals on them. One of a wolf howling to the moon and the other a gorilla pounding its chest and roaring the sky. The patches were still dangling threads from where they were ripped off the uniforms. One from a gorilla quirk guy and the other from a werewolf. The werewolf was a good fight, he said, smiling at them all. "Nice," Kachan said and then turned to head to the exit. "Let's get out of here, follow me nerds." Kaminari snorted. "Says the guy who placed 4th in academic ranking." Kachan grinned viciously back at him as he walked. "That's right, I'm the alpha nerd." "Isn't that technically Izuku?" Siro smirked back and pointed at a puffed-up Izuku. "Didn't he place 3rd?" The group of boys laughed at Kachan's angry growl and stomping steps as they headed to the exit to the exams. Izuku chatted with the small part of his pack and headed to the waiting room for the next phase of the exam. He mainly listened to them as they explained what they did and how the class split after he had left. Izuku was immensely proud of their strategy and complimented them for staying together like a pack should. The feral boy happily trotted along with the other boys to the room. "You're not a Shiketsu student," the tall boy who was glaring at Roki earlier said, not far from the small pack. While not glaring, he was looking down at Izuku with a frown. Izuku looked up at the tall boy with the same hat he currently had on his head. Of course not, I just found it and liked it," he said with a beaming smile. The group with Izuku stopped to listen and stayed near their pack leader to see where this went. Izuku didn't see them but could smell the scent of more of his pack very nearby. He immediately caught the scent of his mate but stayed focused on the tall boy. "You didn't read the rules of the exams? You were breaking them by taking from other examinees' uniforms or support equipment," he said, not unkindly but still frowning at the much smaller boy before him. Izuku stilled at not having thought about that. In all honesty, he didn't read the rules or even know there were rules other than not killing or maiming people. He thought quickly and hatched a brilliant plan inspired by some movies he had watched with his pack and mate during the weekends in the common room. Kachan watched with some interest to see what his old friend did, but what he did surprised even him. He watched as Izuku became meek-looking and looked down while rubbing his arm. He raised an eyebrow at seeing such an odd sight. He shrugged when the others looked at him. I don't know how to read," Izuku said quietly. He sniffed as tears began to well up at the corner of his eyes with the help of pushing at his tear ducts. "What?" the tall boy said in surprise, his eyebrows raised to his hairline. "What?" Kachan's group said in unison. Izuku looked around in faux nervousness. I didn't go to school for a long time because I was out in the woods for a while. He looked at the tall boy for his reaction and internally cheered at his ploy working. I've been working on it, but it's hard and I've been getting help from Nem. He looked at his packmates with shame. I'm sorry I lied. Mina watched with utter confusion at her mate's behavior and was about to put it up to the other boy's quirk, but by the look on his face, he didn't know what to say. Then it clicked, she should probably be more careful with the movies they showed Izuku from now on. But she couldn't betray her mate in a moment of need. She bumped shoulders with Shinso near her and made a subtle motion as she went to Izuku's side. Zuku, it's all right. You don't have anything to be ashamed of. Mina came to his side and hugged him tightly. I know it's been hard, but I'll help you in whatever you need. Toshi came up to his other side and gripped his other shoulder in solidarity. He was eternally grateful for the addition of a half mask to his costume that hid the threatening smile that he couldn't contain. You've saved me from getting beaten, and for that, I will never look down on you for such a simple thing as knowing how to read. Most of the pack looked on in shock at what was happening, which helped greatly at Izuku's act. Thank you, guys. He looked gratefully at them with more tears threatening to spill. Let's get to the next phase for now, alright? Jiro decided to join in and nudged them to the waiting room. The four left a dumbfounded pack of 1A and the tall boy from Shiketsu High School standing there. 1A quickly followed after a moment of recovery and ran after the four. Izuku and the other three quickly closed the door behind them, and he quickly took off the hat and stuffed it under his shirt where it sunk into his flesh to hide in his abdomen. He also produced the two emblems from his hunt and added them to his hat. What the shit was that? Toshi immediately turned to his best friend. Language, Izuku said in reply and pointed at Toshi. Don't you language me. What was all that about? Toshi slapped the hand away. There were rules, I guess, and I didn't want to give my stuff back, so I did that. He sheepishly pointed back at the door where they came from. You did not. Jiro laughed with a wheeze. Mina looked at her mate with a soft smile and shook her head. She pinched his cheeks and shook him side to side gently. You little manipulator. Izuku let his mate grab him and smiled at her. After a moment, he pushed her hands off his reddening cheeks and quickly said to them as he heard the rest of his pack come from the other side of the door. I gave the hat to a person who works here. He looked at each of them and they nodded with understanding. Kachan was the first through the doorway and was already narrowing his eyes at his old friend. He could smell a ploy from a mile away. He only needed to get a smell of it to understand what had happened. Izuku looked back at him and gave him a sly grin. He snorted and shook his head before going to the snack table set up and grabbing water. The pack gave Izuku odd looks but didn't say anything. The tall boy came in after 1A and looked much less stern and more awkward. He turned to the small horned and green-haired boy and saw the hat was nowhere to be seen, so he let the matter drop. What happened to the hat? Kachan asked before Izuku. I gave it to a person who worked here, he said with zero hesitation. Kachan stared at him and didn't believe it for a second. He recalled the time returning from the USJ and how Ida wanted to take his trophy away. Sure. It's true, I saw him do it, Mina said solemnly. She put an arm around Izuku's shoulders. It's all right, we'll get you a better hat later. She dropped her head on his shoulder. Izuku nodded while her horn poked at his cheek. I'll get a hat. He sniffed the air and locked onto the snacks laid out. But, food first. He made to get up and smiled at Mina, who pouted at losing her headrest. Grab me something, Toshi said, seated on the bench. Shoji joined Izuku at the snacks and they both went through their choices. The feral boy scanned every kind of granola bar and fruit set out. He grabbed a few bottles of water, 6 different kinds of bars, and reluctantly 1 apple. Nem had told him he needed more fruits and vegetables in his diet. Shoji grabbed a few things for himself and joined his friend. Izuku tossed the water to Toshi and it bounced off his head when he wasn't paying attention. He glared at Izuku and he acted like it should have been his fault for not being fast enough. Mina took one of the waters and looked through the loot Izuku had pilfered. She picked one that looked appetizing and opened it to eat it. She looked at the apple held by one of his tendrils and eyed Izuku until he reluctantly bit it in half. She smiled at him and went back to her snack. While Izuku didn't mind eating healthy foods and quite liked the taste of them, he didn't like being told to do things. It would have been more effective for everyone to place the healthy food near him and he would have eaten it without any complaint. So he grudgingly ate the rest of the apple in a few bites and then moved on to the tasty-smelling snacks. He carefully opened each one to save the wrappers in case he liked the taste as the lamb sticks back at the dorms. Izuku looked up when he caught the scent of the rest of his packmates. He beamed at them and they joined the rest of the class. Roki smiled back at Izuku when he caught his eye. He sat next to him with water and asked, "Did you enjoy your hunt?" He was still learning of Izuku's unusual actions, but he had enjoyed talking to a blunt person like himself. Izuku nodded with a smile. One good one, but he was strong. Looked like a werewolf, but he did last a bit. He even managed to fight against my presence while we fought, he said with approval. That's unusual, don't most animal quirks users freeze upon it? Roki asked. I think it was because I wasn't trying to stop him but just fight. Like the others around me at the time didn't help him and might have sensed that. Izuku shrugged. He was about to pull out the trophies to show off but stopped and found the tall boy looking in their direction from across the room. When he looked closer, he was looking at Roki. He pouted slightly and asked his packmate how his exam went. The elemental user told Izuku about his fights and how they went. The second phase of the exam will begin soon. The voice came from the speaker in the room. Izuku looked up from his snacks to the TV that flickered on. It showed a still image of the exam grounds and then it was exploding. There were many shouts of shock at the scene, but then it settled down as hundreds of people began to stream out of doorways to the ruins, all dressed the same. Kachan, did you set off any of those bombs? Izuku asked in the quiet of the room. Of fucking course I didn't. If I did, we'd all probably be dead. Kachan snorted and batted the empty water bottle out of the air, anticipating it. He smirked down at his old friend. Bad words. He pointed. The second phase will focus on rescue after a villain attack. The volunteers will be scattered across the exam area and your job will be to get them to safety. The video showed the people in blue shirts with an acronym smearing possibly fake blood on themselves. Begin. The waiting room opened up and everyone was put in front of the disaster site. Izuku put his hands on his hips and looked around. He caught the sight of a young-looking boy running up to him with the blood on him and tears in his eyes. He could smell his emotions vaguely. So Izuku was sure he wasn't hurt but faking it. The boy blubbered something incomprehensible with snot dripping down his nose. Izuku was the first one to him. He bent down and dipped his finger in the fake blood on his face. He brought it to his nose and sniffed it. Then he tasted it but quickly spit it out while immediately purging the surface taste buds on his tongue to get rid of the taste. Hunter, what are you doing? Yaoyorozu asked with her brows scrunched up. Everyone near them was in a similar state. I can smell blood, but this wasn't blood. It tastes awful. He shook his head to get rid of it, but it lingered taste. Rotting meat tastes better. He spat again in a futile effort. How do you know what rotting meat tastes like? An unknown examinee asked. Izuku glanced at them and shrugged. I couldn't find anything else to eat. He ignored them and bent down to the boy. You're acting, right? So treat this as it's real, easy enough. The boy stuttered at the emotional backhand one after another from the green-haired boy and got back into character. My grandpa is stuck. He pointed back where he came. Izuku straightened and nodded. Okay, I can find him. Where do we take you? There? He mumbled for a moment before finding the triage zone that was already being set up by some others. I'll start looking. He began to head off, sniffing the air where the boy came from. -3 points. You didn't introduce yourself. You didn't check for injuries, and you left me here. The boy pointed at Izuku. Izuku looked back and frowned. But I can smell injuries, the blood. That stuff is just smeared on you as you fell in it, and they were going to get you to the area. He pointed at Yaoyorozu, who was already moving to the boy but had stopped. But I did forget my name, he grumbled. The boy scrunched up his nose at the explanation and nodded at his reasoning. Animal-based quirks have always had a disadvantage in this part of the exam just for that. Empathy quirks and some others too. All right, -1 then. Izuku nodded in acceptance and began to sniff the area for more victims of the attack. The rest of the class spread out and teamed up to find people. Most followed Izuku while looking near where he passed. Shoji, Jiru, and Izuku had the best senses to find people and they took the lead. It didn't take long for Izuku to find an old man with the scent of the boy. Hello. I'm Hunter and you are being rescued, Izuku proclaimed to the old man trapped under some rubble. My grandson. The old man cried out. He's safe, we found him. Sato smiled reassuringly and then looked to Izuku as they positioned themselves to lift the rubble. After Izuku checked to see if they could pick it up without anything collapsing, he nodded. "Hold on, old man," Izuku said as he crouched near him to pick the rubble up. Sato and Izuku both heaved and the rubble lifted easily with their combined strength. Sato looked at the old man for injuries and then carried him away to safety. Izuku nodded and went back to sniffing the area as tendrils extended from his body with noses like dogs to sniff the area even quicker. Time passed quickly with Izuku roaming around locating people and then calling others over to get them to safety. He helped in many situations where he held up structures while others rescued the victims. But he mostly found victims hidden in rubble or odd places. "Help! I'm blind and deaf," a woman said sitting on top of a pillar of rubble. "How the fuck did she get up there, oi?" Kachan shouted in frustration at the woman. Izuku had to agree with him. "She isn't even hurt." He had his hands on his hips and was looking up at her still shouting. "Just, get her down already." Kachan sighed. Izuku did so by extending dozens of tendrils. He smirked when he saw the woman flinch at the sound of the tendrils growing and the sight of them getting near her. The first one patted her arm and she flinched back so hard that she toppled back from it. Luckily, the dozen tendrils behind her caught her and lowered her. "Faker." Kachan scowled and patted the woman's arm to calm her down. Yes, I am here," he said sarcastically. Suddenly there was a loud explosion in the distance that caused the area to rumble. Izuku and Kachan both shielded the woman from any flying debris with their bodies. Once the area was settled down, they too looked over at the smoke and each other. Just as they were about to speak, the tired voice announced, "The villains have returned to wreak havoc once again. Fend them off while continuing to rescue victims of their attack." He paused and then said surprised, What are they doing here?" The rest of was cut off. "I was about to say, it would have been safer if I never left the woods." Izuku snorted at the thought of another villain attack. "Shut up, nerd. You barely left it as is." Kachan snarked. Izuku paused and sniffed the air. He beamed and hopped from foot to foot. "I gotta go. Take her to safety." The wings exploded from his back and he launched into the air to follow the scent. "Oi!" Kachan yelled at his old friend. He looked at the woman who gagged from the sound of breaking bones and tearing flesh from Izuku. "You're supposed to be deaf, you didn't hear that? Come on, I want to see what the feral ass ran off to." Kachan gently guided the woman to the triage zone. Izuku flew over the ruins with excitement. He dove down and picked up one of the minions with black masks and a gun. He pulled off the mask and beamed at the woman under it. "I remember you," he said into the face of the pale-faced woman. She smiled stiffly at him but clung tightly to his arm which dangled her over 20 feet in the air. "What's this do?" He looked at the gun and remembered what Snipe taught him. He shot a glop of cement at the wall and it hardened. Neat. Izuku dove down with the woman screaming and he pulled up just in time to set the woman down and then he shot her legs with the gun. He then flew off to find the scent. He shot the odd minion as he flew towards the smoke and then finally found him. "Gang! I found you!" Izuku shouted with his enhanced lungs and vocal cords. He tossed the gun to the side and beamed down at his mentor. "Izuku! You grew wings!" Gang Orca shouted back at him in greeting. Izuku beamed back at his mentor and then dove down at him. He was the villain after all. He didn't get close as something slammed so hard on his side that his ribs creaked. He was sent sailing out of control and slammed into the ground, his wing broken and the other torn. He got up and repaired the wings before looking at who attacked him. "You, Rimiki, the bunny lady. I remember you from the festival." He pointed at the woman in a leotard and rabbit ears pointed straight up. Her smile dropped and her ears flattened against her head. "What did you call me, Pipsqueak?" she growled out. "Rikimimi, the bunny lady." Izuku dodged out of the way just in time as the ground exploded where he was just at. He lashed out and clipped her arm with his claws. "I'm a rabbit, not a bunny," she growled out, ignoring the bleeding claw mark on her arm. She got out of the crater she left and glared at the boy she wanted to test since that day. "No, you're a rabbit. I can tell, I've killed hundreds," Izuku said as a matter of fact. Mirko didn't respond other than a feral grin. Izuku could smell the eagerness of a fight coming off of her and he was just as happy to oblige. He smiled back with true feral emotions and his body shifted. Mariko's face contorted at the sound but watched as his wings bent unnaturally and connected to his tailbone. The wings disconnected and became a tail with a spear shaping quickly from bone. His teeth sharpened and his body became taller than her. His arms extended as the claws sharpened even further than before. His paws did the same and his eyes doubled. 4 eyes stared at her with feral glee. "You will be a good hunt." He pointed at her. The hunter could have ended the fight quickly with his presence unleashed and focused on her, but he didn't want to win with that method. He wanted to win with his body alone. He wanted a true fight, not something like the werewolf where he tested his presence against opponents. So instead, the hunter charged with his teeth bared in a permanent smile. Mirko easily dodged the initial strike, but the speed of the tail caught her off guard for a second until she smiled herself at the challenge. She picked up the speed herself and responded with the tail swipe by sending a flurry of kicks to the side of the creature before her. The first few impacts didn't hurt, but it was enough to push him off course. He quickly adapted to her speed and returned the flurry of attacks with his own. His claws slashed, his tail whipped, and his teeth bit down, but all missed or were blocked while he received more strikes from her. They weren't the worst strikes he had taken, but they stung. He quickly changed his tactics and raked the concrete with his claws. He launched a bloom of dust and concrete chunks towards Mirko's eyes. She covered them and retreated. She knew this tactic. The hunter pounced right after the blinding attack, but it was less than effective. Instead of catching her unawares, he was kicked in the side of the head and was sent spinning. "Mirko," Gang admonished her as he looked at Izuku with worry. "He's good," Mirko said, grinning from ear to ear. Izuku's head was rattled but quickly came to what had happened. He pulled himself up and felt his broken jaw. His 4 eyes locked onto Mirko's too. Without looking away, his jaw cracked back into place without raising a finger. He dropped to all fours and began to prowl around the standing woman. His tail lashes the air from time to time as he observes the woman. Super move. Adrenaline overdose. A dozen voices rumbled in unison. The hunter's body began to produce enough adrenaline to kill a lesser man and diffused it along his body faster than the blink of an eye. The concrete shattered under his feet as he charged Mirko faster than before. She was caught off guard by the sudden speed and was launched away. The hunter didn't let up and sprinted after her with a bestial roar. Mirko managed to counter with a kick of her own as his fist impacted against her foot. The air cracked at the sound of the impact and they were launched away from each other. The hunter shot out tendrils to slow his backward slide. He nimbly landed on his paws and charged back with a dozen tendrils whipping behind him. Mirko for her part landed against the wall of the arena and used it as a launching platform. It cracked under her powerful legs. She swung her leg around and axe kicked where she predicted the hunter to be. She missed, and concrete shrapnel shot everywhere. The hunter roared in pain but pushed forward with his clawed hand aimed at the leg still embedded in the ground. Everyone's fights began to waver as their eyes were drawn to the fight between Mirko and a beast. Even Gang Orca couldn't keep his eyes off of the fight. It was primal with no words thrown, only grunts of effort and animalistic growls. And was what the fight was, animalistic. Izuku didn't think, only acted like an animal while Mirko was trained for years. Izuku was again kicked into the ground where he left a crater. He roared in anger as a bloody Mirko slammed her foot down on his chest. He coughed up blood and felt his ribs break. With blood running out of his mouth, he grabbed onto her leg and whipped her to the ground. She slammed into it and then was picked up again and slammed down once more before being thrown full force at the wall where she slumped against it. The hunter took a break and made his caved-in chest pop back out. His ribs were repaired and his lungs inflated properly. He breathed in and let out a long growl as Mirko got up on unsteady legs. Her silver hair was stained red with blood and she had multiple lacerations across her body. She still looked at him with a feral smile. Meanwhile, Izuku's bruises healed before everyone's eyes and his clothes were knit closed along with any wounds. "You are one tough son of a bitch," Mirko cackled. Izuku growled and lowered to charge once again. "Don't call my mother that." Mirko smiled back and lowered herself to meet the charge. "Make me, lunar arc." She made the first move with her leg. Super move. Remove restrictions. The hunter charged back with a roar. On a few of Izuku's research binges, he had found many stories of people without any kind of muscle or strength quirks doing impossible things. One famous story was of a mother lifting a car off of her son who was being crushed by it in the pre-quirk era. All these stories have in common that the person who did the impossible was in life and death situation. So, Izuku found what gave people this ability, and it was powerful, but the drawback was damaging his body. The body can outperform its best in a life and death situation, but if we had that active all the time, we would rip our bodies apart. Izuku learned how to turn these limitations off, and with his compressed muscles and bones, it compounded to great effects. The concrete shattered and his paws were almost ripped apart at his sudden acceleration. His bones creaked and his muscles ached even with all the adrenaline in his body. The two met in midair and impacted against each other. The hunter's fist shot up to meet the descending leg of Mirko. The two impacted and bones cracked. A sonic boom was heard through the building and the two were launched back from each other again. Mirko's leg was moved wrong and Izuku's arm was torn from the inside out. The hero landed harshly against the ground and groaned in pain from her leg to the rest of her battered body. Izuku was launched through a collapsed building's wall and stopped at a pillar. Everyone watched in horror at the aftermath of such an exchange and quickly moved to help the both of them. Todoroki was the first to Izuku's side and gasped at seeing his state. "Izuku, are you all right?" The half-and-half boy couldn't help but ask as he knelt next to him, unsure what to do with the rebar sticking out of his stomach. "Alive." Izuku groaned and tried to move, but the rebar held him back. He groaned with pain all over his body and he reached for the rebar, but his arm responded slowly. He looked at it and it was purple and bloody with torn muscles. "I just grew that back," he whined. "Don't move," Gang Orca said near him. "I'm fine." Izuku showed this by having a tendril shear off the rebar and then he yanked it out of his belly. He groaned in pain but tossed it to the side as he began to repair the vital organs. Nothing important was hit other than his intestinal tracts. He got to his knees and then stumbled onto his paws. "Mikaminimi," he shouted and stumbled out of the hole he created. "Izuku, sit down, you are hurt seriously," Gang implored. Izuku held a clawed finger to Gang's mouth. "Shush, you are a villain and I don't listen to villains." He stumbled out into the light to find Mirko trying to get up but failing due to all the staff trying to hold her down. He saw this and could only say one thing. "I win," he roared with a dozen voices. "Ha! Like hell, you did. Once I get up I'ma get your dirty hands off of me." Mirko fought against the attendants who were trying to put her in a gurney. "Izuku. The exam ended a while ago." Gang Orca pulled at Izuku's shoulder to sit due to his recent injuries. He turned to his mentor in confusion. "Oh, all right." Izuku shifted back to normal with some effort and dropped to the ground. "Did we pass?" he asked from the ground. Gang huffed out a breath and knelt to pat Izuku's head. "You'll find out soon. How are your injuries?" he asked. Izuku took stock of his body. Most of his muscles were sore from his super move. His stomach was already repaired and he was currently working on fixing his arm. It was simple enough since he had the materials he needed but only needed energy to reconstruct the torn muscles and ligaments. "I'm hungry," he finally said with a nod. Gang snorted out a laugh. "I'll take that as you're fine. It was nice to see you." He ruffled his hair and got up to check on the other hero being carted off. A pair of footsteps sounded behind Izuku and he tilted his head back to see who it was. He fell onto his back and stared up at Kachan. "What happened?" he asked with his hands on his hips. "Rimikimi showed up and we fought. I won," Izuku said, beaming from his back. Kachan frowned down at his old friend and then looked questioning at Todoroki. "Mirko and him fought," he answered. The blonde looked down at Izuku with his eyebrows raised. "Mirko? The number 5 hero? If that's a bunny hero, then yep." She said she wasn't a bunny but I could tell. "Rabbits smell different from bunnies," he said with confidence. Kachan eyed him for a long moment before shaking his head and leaving him prone on the ground. "Come on, then. The exam is over." Izuku and the other two reunited with the rest of the pack soon after. The pack leader made sure everyone was accounted for and with a nod, headed to the locker room to change. "You fought Mirko," Kaminari said after Izuku explained why his arm was still red from his super move. "Yep," Izuku said, beaming. There was a quiet moment before saying, "Was she hot?" Kaminari asked. Izuku paused and frowned. "She didn't have any fire abilities, I think. Roki, did she?" He turned to the half-dressed boy. "No, she doesn't," he said and then asked. "Why ask me? Not all fire users are related," he said, smirking slightly. Izuku looked conflicted. "Are you sure?" Kachan scoffed. Of course not. You and Shoji aren't related, are you? He said sarcastically. We might be, Izuku said indignantly and turned to the big pack member for his opinion. Shoji looked at all of them and his eyes crinkled in a smile hidden behind his mask. We might be. Kacchan scowled at the bigger boy while everyone around them chuckled and laughed. Don't encourage him. All of Class 1A was gathered in front of a large screen with the rest of the students who passed Phase 1. Izuku had already gotten a scolding from his mate when she saw his slightly bruised arm. The muscles were just about done reconstructing, but they were visibly injured to anyone who looked. Everyone stopped talking when the screen flickered on to show every name with a score next to the name. There were many cheers and an equal amount of groans. Izuku found his name and his score of 78. He pouted at getting such a low score but was happy overall at passing. He caught Mina as she leapt on him in jubilation at seeing her score in the passing range. He beamed and hugged her in return. She let go and went to Hagakure to celebrate together with the other girl. He turned back to the screen and looked at everyone else's names to see if everyone had passed. They did, and he was overjoyed to see his whole pack had passed the exam. The lowest was Roki with a score of 56. Kacchan was behind him with his chin raised and a smirk on his face. Kinda low there, Izuku. Izuku frowned in confusion and turned back to the screen to see that Kacchan had scored higher than him, by 5 points. He turned back with a scowl. It's only 5 points, he said with the tone to make it sound like it wasn't a big deal. Kacchan smirked even more. Sure, tell yourself that. He finished by waving his hand nonchalantly and turning away. Izuku did the mature thing and kicked him in the back of the knee just as his other was bent while he walked. The blonde crumpled at the unexpected move and he fell to the ground to his knees. You little shit. Kacchan roared as Izuku bolted away with a cackle. He got up and sprinted off after him. The pack of 1A marveled at their shiny new licenses before them. They were outside waiting next to their bus to head back to the dorms. Most of them were taking pictures and talking on their phones with family to pass the news. Izuku wasn't any different as he called Nem. Izuku. How did it go? Did you pass? If you didn't, you don't have anything to worry about. It took me 3 tries to pass when I was your age. Nem spoke first. I passed, Izuku said beaming. Nem squealed in joy and Izuku could hear her hopping in place. That's wonderful, honey. I'm so proud of you. Izuku felt his throat close up at hearing that and sucked in tears threatening to come out. Thank you, Mom. He sniffed once. The line was quiet for a moment before Nem's voice came through again. I'll cook up something nice tonight, swing on by alright? He could hear the watery tone on the other end. Okay. Love you, honey. I'll see you in a bit. Izuku paused for a second at the words and thought about Nem. She took care of him since the day they met. She watched over him, explained things to him, spent time with him, and had fun together. She checked in on him frequently throughout the day and worried about him when he was injured or when villains attacked his class. Namori was what Inko was supposed to be and he was happy things turned out this way. I love you too, he said smiling at the ground. Soon after, the phone call ended and Izuku noticed the stares from his pack. What? He asked with his head tilted in confusion. Kirishima tentatively asked. You said, Mom, we thought your mother was in jail. He looked unsure and looked at the others with nods. Inko is in jail. He paused and a look of realization came over him. Oh, that was Nem. She's my mom now, he said beaming at them. She adopted you? That's wonderful, Yaoyorozu said first. Her hands clasped together and she smiled happily at the news. The rest of the pack joined in soon with their congratulations on hearing the news. Their licenses were forgotten for the moment to hear their pack leader tell them about his birthday party and the gift Nem had given him. Aizawa had joined them halfway through the story and waited quietly for him to finish with softer eyes than usual at the green-haired horned boy tell everyone about getting adopted by Namori. When the story was over, Aizawa herded everyone onto the bus. Once everyone was on board, the bus began to move and head home. Shiro stood up in his seat near his teacher and asked him, Yo, Aizawa, do they always have 2 top heroes for the exam? Sit down, Aizawa commanded him without turning around and after a moment spoke again. No, usually it's someone in Gang Orca's level or many lower level heroes. There were some sounds of confusion at that and Yaoyorozu asked, then why was Mirko there? Aizawa turned around finally and locked eyes with Izuku, who was kicking his legs like a child. She just showed up. I'll let you guess why. Izuku looked around at everyone who stared at him. Makinimi was there to fight me, he said with his eyebrows raised, and then he nodded in understanding. Well, she lost, he said cheerily. God, you are terrible at remembering names, Toshi said across the aisle from him with a small smile. It was getting dark and Izuku was having a celebration dinner with Nem. She immediately embraced her son as soon as he walked through the threshold of the small home. Izuku melted in her arms and returned the embrace. She sat him down at the dinner table, placed a hot meal in front of him, and let him enjoy the taste of lamb chops she had gotten for a special occasion. She joined him at the dinner table and asked him about the exam. He happily told him about the werewolf, saving civilians, finding gang, and then fighting the number 5 hero. She was surprised at hearing the last part and smiled warmly at him when he told her about their fight. And, I got these. Izuku proudly showed off his trophies to his mother. Tendrils snaked out of his side to present him with the 2 patches, the hat, and something he was able to grab from the hero he fought. Nomori took them carefully to examine them. She smiled knowingly at Izuku and lightly rebuked him. I'm pretty sure the rules for the exams prevent you from taking things from other examinees. Izuku looked sheepishly at his mother as she continued. But I won't say anything. What's this? She held a metal part. That's from Kimirimi's boots. The last hit broke a few bones. That was lodged in my hand and I figured out it was part of her boots. I think it's the back part since she axe kicked me, he said proudly as he took the hat and placed it on his head with his curly hair puffing out the sides of the hat. She smiled at his terrible way of forgetting names and pinched his nose. They're great trophies. He beamed at her and took the patches to cut the patches from the fabric that still clung on. Small tendrils came out with a scalpel-like blade on the ends to cut them ever so carefully. Nem smiled warmly at him as he worked on his trophies. While she hated what that woman did to Izuku, she was grateful it turned out this way with him as her son. Izuku, honey. You can't just threaten a cat like that, Nem said gently but reproachfully to her son. Izuku pointed at the Bengal cat who was seated next to him on the lawn of her home and cleaning herself with her paw. She started it, he shouted like a child. Nem put her hands on her hips and frowned down at him with an expression that could be described as incredulous. She left some fur and bones from her meal at your den. Izuku crossed his arms and pouted. I like to keep my den clean. And, I eat my bones. He turned to glare at the cat who looked innocently up at the 2 humans. She then rolled over to show her belly for rubs and Nem obliged happily. Izuku narrowed his eyes at the cat as she purred while she was being stroked gently. If you explain that to her, she will learn, Nem said crouching down next to Izuku who was seated on the grass. I'll teach her all right, Izuku grumbled. Nem smiled at him and his adorable pouting face. She pinched his cheek and then kissed the top of his forehead while getting up. All right, I'm off to work. Be good. Izuku smiled at her affection and waved. Bye. After a moment, he looked at the cat. She got up and stared at him. Don't leave a mess at my den, he said seriously. The cat chirped and butted her head against his leg. He huffed out a breath and awkwardly patted her head before getting up and heading to the dorms. He trotted from Nem's home back to where most of his packmates were resting. At the back door, he slid it open and the cat slipped inside. He ignored her and made his way to the cabinet where his lamb sticks were. He grabbed one and made his way to the common room where some of his packmates lay around. Hey, Zoo. His mate greeted him with a beaming smile. She sat next to Hagakuri who was leaning on her shoulder while she typed away on her phone. She glanced down and raised an eyebrow. Who's that? Izuku smiled in return but then frowned slightly at the question. He looked down and saw the cat walking lazily around and sniffing the area. Oh, you. The cat looked up at him and chirped. If you have a pet, you must gain approval from the faculty, Iida said while chopping his arms. He motioned to Kutra for an example. Isn't that the same cat from the first day at the dorms? Suyu noted with a croak. Izuku curled his lip slightly at the cat who was prowling around with his packmates trying to coax her for pets. Not mine. She just stays near here and leaves messes in my den. He eyed the animal with narrowed eyes. Don't be like that, Zoo. Just look at her. Mina picked up the cat and held her up like Simba from The Lion King. The cat let out a long meow as she dangled limply from Mina's grasp. Toshi crawled near and gently brushed his hand over the cat's head. She butted her head into his hand and purred audibly. He smiled and coaxed the cat to leap onto his lap after Mina put her down. He continued to stroke her fur, ecstatic to have a cat in his lap. He looked up at Izuku and raised a brow at feeling his best friend's animosity towards the cat. Hagakure giggled and asked the local feral child, "Izuku, or perhaps jealous of the cat?" Her sleeve went up to her mouth to cover her mouth. Everyone turned to Izuku and he looked back towards everyone. I'm better than her in every way." He stomped his paw like a petulant child. The room tried to hold in their snorts and laughter, but it was futile, which caused Izuku to pout. Mina got up and brought his head down to hug it. She brushed his ever-messy hair and cooed, "Of course, you are my green apex predator." Kachan snorted at the display. "For being one of the most dangerous people here, you sure are delicate." He shook his head and turned back to the TV. Mina pulled Izuku to the couch and had him sit down in front of her on the ground between her legs. She began to untangle his bird's nest of hair. He relaxed under her touch and leaned comfortably back under his mate's grooming. The rest of the class got back to doing whatever they were doing before the small interruption. Mina happily chatted with Hagakure while she braided Izuku's hair. He let out a sigh of contentment. Later that night, the hunter wandered his territory. It was nearing sunset and he was looking around for a snack before settling in his den. The animals in his territory had gotten smart quickly and found ways of hiding from him or digging their dens deeper to avoid his notice. That didn't deter him from hunting. He was currently eyeing a small den of gophers when he paused and sniffed the air. He tilted his head at the scent of fresh blood. Ignoring the gophers, he turned in the direction of the scent. It didn't take him long to find the wall of his territory and the grounds of Ua. But the scent of blood was very close and on the other side of the wall. He looked around before shifting back to normal and then leaping onto a tree. From there, he jumped to the top of the wall to peer over it. His claws dug grooves into the thick concrete as he lifted himself up and over the wall. He stood on it and looked around to find the source of the scent. On the other side of the wall was a road with a sidewalk hugging the wall. Across the road were the backs of buildings. Not much movement, but looking down, he found the source of the scent. A trail of blood led to a limp form of a dog. Even from 15 feet off the ground, he could tell it was fatally wounded. He leapt down and landed with a thump on the sidewalk. Getting close to the dog showed it was still alive but breathing with much difficulty. Izuku crouched down next to the dog, a mutt by his estimation, and looked at his wounds. Dark brown fur was matted with blood from its belly. Its back legs looked wrong and so did its spine. He could see blood leaking from its nose, which led to internal bleeding. It was a matter of time until the dog died. The feral boy had grown used to the death of animals around him, and this was no different. But he knew dogs have almost always been companions to people, and he could imagine this mutt belonging to someone. So he stayed with him in his last moments. The mutt gave a wheezing breathing and opened its eyes. Bright blue eyes looked around and landed on Izuku's crouched form. He could see the mild intelligence in the animal's eyes, and he could see the animal understood it was dying. Izuku didn't say anything but stayed near the dog as he could smell the fear coming off the dog. The fear wasn't directed at him but at his coming end. He gently brushed his hand over the mutt's ears in comfort and the dog whimpered. Then Izuku felt something being sent his way from the dog, a faint connection. With curiosity, he accepted the connection and Izuku felt the dog's mind. He had a quirk. It was very rare for animals to have a quirk. The dog sent faint emotions to Izuku, almost words. Fear, pain, loneliness, sadness, and finally a small bit of hope. He felt the dog tell him what had happened. A large car had hit the back of his body while he tried to cross the road. How he scavenged for food in alleys. How he was always shunned by other packs. How he was alone and now dying. Izuku took all that in and thought about what he could do to help. The mutt was far too injured to get any help. Not even that old woman could help the dog in its state. He did think he could give the dog a quick end but then paused. He might be able to help. "I can try and save you but it might not work," Izuku said tentatively, both verbally and with the faint connection the dog had made. He received pleading in return, and that's all Izuku needed. He extended tendrils to lock the dog's body how it was to minimize any more injuries, and then he began to climb the walls back to his territory. It took a while but he got over the barrier and then he bolted to his den. Once there, he gently lowered the animal to the grass. With the connection failing, Izuku spoke. This will hurt, but I will help you. He received acceptance and then he began. First, he needed to make sure the dog didn't die from blood loss and oxygen deprivation. He focused on the brain to begin. With a tendril, he quickly found the carotid arteries and began to copy the blood the dog had. With an external heart to pump the blood he created, he connected to the dog's circulatory system isolated to his head. The dog whimpered at the pain. Izuku quickly made a parasite connected to him and blocked the nervous system at the neck to free the dog from pain. The mutt relaxed some and he got back to work. Halfway through fixing the dog's spinal column, Izuku's arm buzzed. He pulled the communication device from his arm and pushed the button while he worked. Izuku, I see that you left the ground and another being came back with you. Is everything all right? Nezu asked calmly. Izuku grunted as the vertebrae cracked and then began to heal stronger than before. Yep, just busy. There was a pause and then Nezu asked, do you need any assistance? With his focus being split at the moment, he was short with the principal. I'm okay. Very well, contact me if you need anything. Nezu cut the line and Izuku absorbed the device back into his arm. The feral boy's knowledge of human and animal biology rivaled some of the geniuses in Japan. He was able to mimic biology not his own so well that it became indistinguishable from the original. For all the benefits he had with his quirk and knowledge, he could not give what was his. He could not donate an infinite amount of the needed blood, he could not donate organs people needed. And he couldn't heal people because if he did then he would become part of that person. His every cell was his quirk and he didn't know what would be the effects of having a living part of him go to someone else. Would the organ or blood act normally without his instruction or would it do something unpredictable and hurt the person? Would his immune system attack the person who receives it and spread it throughout their body to cause devastating damage? Too many questions and no way of safety testing it without a creature. So that is what Izuku will do with the mutt. He will heal him and make it so his created blood and organs will work with the dog's natural body. And maybe on the way, he could improve the canine to something better. Better lungs, stronger bones, and improved red and white blood cells. Just the very basics of what Izuku made him the best hunter. The dog slipped in and out of consciousness at times. He was confused but free of pain. At some point, the cat arrived and it sat a few feet away from the two just watching intently at Izuku's work. He wasn't sure how intelligent the cat was but the way she watched tendrils slip in and out of the dog's body to modify its parts was not natural. He wondered if she had a quirk as well, but pushed those thoughts away to continue to focus on the dog's body. Its rear legs were healed from their pulverized form. He strengthened the bones with his mass and added compact muscles. Not to the degree Izuku had, but the dog would be much stronger than any normal dog should be. His spinal column was fixed with added nerves to enhance its response time. The spine was made to be more flexible like his with the added bone density. He copied everything he had done to the front legs to ensure his base body didn't strain from having a better lower half. He healed a cancer that was beginning to grow on the dog's lungs and improved them as well. Every organ was cleaned and vastly enhanced. His claws were changed to become more dense and the cells that made them grow changed to keep the changes in the future. Bone marrow was thickened to produce more blood when needed and he made sure it was compatible with the dog's body. Finally, he moved on to the head, the most delicate part of the body. He produced serotonin and mixed it into the blood, keeping the dog alive to make sure it didn't wake at a bad time when working on the brain and its connecting neurons. He worked from the inside out, starting at the brain. He made sure there was no visible sickness such as tumors or anything of the sort. When he finished adding the nerves to the proper connections, Izuku improved the senses of the dog. His nose was already good and only added a small improvement. His ears were mostly left alone, but his eyes were reconstructed to his standards. Izuku knew dog eyes were subpar in the animal kingdom, so he copied his own into the dog's. After that, he moved on to the teeth and jaws. They were simple to modify. Stronger teeth and denser muscles in the jaws. He finished having hair like tendrils rake the dog's fur to clean the crusted blood. Any parasites were consumed and the skin knit closed finally. He tenderly extracted from his arteries while he healed the wounds. He watched very carefully for any signs of something going wrong, but so far the dog's lungs and heart took up the work once again. Then he absorbed the parasite that kept the dog numb and paralyzed. Again, no ill signs, and Izuku tentatively leaned back from his work. The dog's breathing and heartbeat were consistent as he slept from fatal injuries to healthier than any dog could be. Izuku hoped the last command he gave to his cells in the dog's body would work. It was a simple command, to keep the dog alive and healthy. Izuku leaned back and let out a breath. He looked around and it was late in the night. The stars shone high above and the cat next to them still sat watching everything he had done. He focused on the dog again and stayed awake the whole night observing his condition in case something went wrong. It was an hour after the sun rose when the dog stirred in his sleep. Izuku set his book aside to watch how the dog acted. The mutt slowly became aware of his surroundings and then began to move. It was tentative at first, most likely expecting pain from its injuries, but was surprised when he felt nothing. The mutt checked for its legs and saw them healed. He sniffed his body and then turned to Izuku, who was seated crisscross watching the dog wake. Izuku felt the connection form between the mutt and him. He felt the dog's mind send him questions about his body and why he felt the way he did. "I healed you and made you better. I wasn't sure if it'll work, but I guess it did," he said to answer the dog. The dog looked around and sent more questions about his eyesight and the colors he had never seen before. Izuku answered every question he was sent without hesitation. Then the dog got up from its seated position and stumbled slightly before righting itself and walking around. He stretched his new body and shook his shaggy fur. The mutt then asked where they were. The questions the dog sent were more emotions than actual words, but Izuku understood them fine enough. He answered, "This is my territory, my den is there. It's part of a place where people go to learn. The others live in a building, but I like it out here more." The mutt sniffed at Izuku and he let him. He sent curious thoughts about the scents he picked up. "My pack, I am the pack leader of them and my mate. Also, a cat that's somewhere around here." Izuku saw a slight sadness at the mention of a pack and felt it through the connection. He watched the dog for a moment and shrugged. "Do you wish to be part of my pack? Live here and be safe?" he asked. The dog perked up at his words and then quickly lowered his body to the ground while wagging his tail furiously in happiness that was sent through the connection. Izuku received several emotions ranging from excitement to joy and then acceptance. The feral boy beamed and sent the emotion through the connection. He gently patted the dog's head and got up to stretch. The dog got up with him and excitedly ran around his legs. "I'm hungry, let's hunt," Izuku said and shifted into his hunter form. The dog was startled but calmed down and curiosity sniffed his legs and body. The hunter led him and then the two were off to find their first meal of the day. The boy and dog walked side by side headed to the dorms. The dog happily looked around and sniffed the area while he chewed on a bone. The dog had quickly learned to adapt to his new body and his new strength. His teeth shredded bone like tough hide and skin like paper. So he was careful with the bone he played around with. They walked up to the back door of the dorms and Izuku instructed the dog to wipe his paws like he did before entering. "Where in all the 9 hells did you find a dog?" Kachan asked incredulously where he was seated at the kitchen counter. He stared at the mutt who looked around curiously and sniffed the floor. The dog looked up at Izuku for permission and sent it through the connection. "This is where my pack lives. Don't hurt anyone," he said sternly and sent the threat through the connection to make sure he understood. When the dog lowered his head, Izuku nodded, and the mutt began to roam near his pack leader. "Stop saying bad words. I found him hurt and helped him," he pointed at his old friend. "Izuku, I have to remind you pets have to be approved by the staff before obtaining them. Also, you need to make sure no one has an allergy to them." Iida chopped his arms while the dog sniffed his mufflers on his legs. Izuku frowned a bit. "But he's not my pet, he's part of my pack," he said beaming at the announcement. You, Kaminari and Shiro happily knelt to pet the dog who happily let them rub his head and back. Yaoyorozu smiled softly with a raised brow. "My family had a few guard dogs, I don't think it's such a bad idea. Especially if he listens to Izuku like the ones at my home did. What's his name?" She leaned down to get a closer look at the dog. Izuku shrugged. "I don't know, I didn't ask." Kachan snorted a laugh. "If you did, would he answer?" When Izuku tilted his head and pursed his lips in thought he stopped and looked at him. "What can you talk to animals now?" he asked incredulously. "I could ask." Koda offered and raised his hand slightly and got close to the animal to begin to speak to it. Sato was with the other 2 boys rubbing the dog's belly. "I always wanted a dog, but would it be all right with Ua?" Kachan was about to snark about letting Izuku live there when Kota yelped in surprise and reared back from the dog. Oh yeah, the dog has a quirk. Some sort of emotional telepathy. No words but emotions, Izuku said casually. Everyone paused at that and then looked at the animal, who paused and felt all the eyes on him. Then he got up and quickly got between Izuku's legs. The dog connected to Izuku and he felt sudden apprehension from the dog. The feral boy sent back reassuring thoughts and patted his head. The dog paused and then sniffed the air before his ears perked up where the stairs were. Mina came trotting down and paused at the scene. The dog quickly trotted over to her and Izuku guessed he caught the scent of his mate. Mina squealed in joy at the dog, who sniffed at her and then happily accepted her affectionate pets. Aren't you precious? Mina cooed and knelt to have the dog lick her hand. Then the dog sat next to her and proudly wagged his tail. Izuku felt a strong emotion sent to him by the dog: protection. Izuku smiled at that and felt happy to have the newest member of his pack doing what he very much approved of. Mina paused finally when she saw everyone's looks directed at the dog. What? She asked, confused, and then she felt the connection form between the dog and her. She widened her eyes at the dog and tentatively accepted the connection. She felt a flood of emotions that told her a story of how he was hurt and Izuku saved him. She reeled at the sudden onslaught but understood and looked at Izuku. Are you all right, Mina? Yaoyorozu asked at her sudden facial expressions. She eyed the dog with trepidation when she learned he had a quirk. Mina patted the dog's head and nodded. Yeah, just got told a story with emotions. It was a lot was all. She stood up and made her way to Izuku to hug him. You did good, she whispered to him. Izuku happily hugged her back and the dog trotted behind Mina to sit by their side. Everyone turned when there was a groan from the stairway to see Toshi with his head tilted to the ceiling in exasperation. Are you going to pick up every stray you find? He asked his best friend. What do you mean you healed him? How? Kachan asked Izuku. A few of his packmates were in the kitchen from the commotion caused by everyone fawning over the friendly dog. While the dog was fighting with Sato and Kirishima, Izuku was telling them how he found the dog and healed him. Well, at first I thought I couldn't use my quirk to heal people because every cell in my body is affected by my quirk. I didn't know what would happen if my cells went into another person's body. It is almost an automatic response to heal any injuries and purge any impurities in my body. So I always thought if my blood or donated organs were put in a person they would react very badly to them. Like a very strong animal put in the middle of weaker animals. Naturally, the strong animal would dominate, and in a human body, death or maybe worse. If anyone didn't know Izuku was as close to being a feral human being, they would think he would be a teacher lecturing his students at the moment as he gestured with his hands and some tendrils for examples. The mutt. Zoo, that's rude. Mina chastised him before he could continue. Izuku paused and looked at the mutt. But that's what he is. Anyway, I asked if he wanted my help even though I wasn't sure if it would work. Toshi rose a bit off of his seat and raised his hands to stop him. Wait. Did you experiment on the dying dog? Izuku, I am pretty morally skewed ever since befriending you, but that's not okay. Everyone looked back and forth between Izuku and Toshi as they talked. He was dying and I told him it might not work, but even if it didn't, he wouldn't feel a thing. I made sure. The only experiment was if his body would accept my cells. I knew everything else I was doing. And they did. Now he's the best dog that ever lived. Izuku defended himself. Iida to the side straightened and looked sharply at Izuku when he realized what he had done. He was about to speak up but Toshi spoke over him. That's still animal experimentation, Toshi said, dragging his hand through his hair. He knew his best friend wouldn't ever do something malicious, but he wanted to make sure he understood the morality of the current situation. Izuku looked completely confused. But you've done animal experimentation too? Everyone looked shocked and whipped their heads to Toshi, who also looked thrown off by the statement. What? No, I haven't. We got a badger to respond to you and your quirk didn't work. That's animal experimentation. Izuku reminded him of his time before Ua. Toshi rubbed his forehead and responded. That's not the same. Of course it is. You are worried the cells I put in the dog's body would kill the dog, but it didn't. What if your quirk killed the badger? But it didn't. He said logically. He turned to Kutra. How did you know your quirk wouldn't hurt the animal you spoke to? Some in the kitchen understood his logic and considered it. Toshi stopped at that and bit his lip in consideration. He opened his mouth a few times in an attempt to say something but nothing came out. He finally let out a sigh and looked at the dog who was seated and watching the whole ordeal going on. As Izuku said, the dog was as healthy as it could be. Iida broke the silence first. Izuku, how much do you know about human biology? I know everything about base human biology and some quirked human biology, Izuku said with confidence. Quirked human biology? What do you mean? Mina asked. Yaoyorozu answered. The base human Izuku is referring to would be a quirkless human. It mostly applies to everyone to a greater extent. My heart would be where yours is and so on. Quirked human biology would be the unique biology of anyone with a quirk. For example, Sato. I'm sure you have something to negate the effects of consuming sugar. She motioned to Sato who was seated next to the dog. Sato nodded. I don't exactly remember the specifics but I remember my liver and pancreas are way better than a normal person's. Also, my blood cells are bigger or something, I can't recall, he said scratching his chin. Yaoyorozu nodded. That also goes for mental quirk users like Shinso. I'm sure if we scanned his brain while he used his quirk it would be very different from everyone else's. Izuku nodded at her perfect explanation. Yep. He smiled at Yaoyorozu. He turned to Iida. Why do you ask? Iida hesitated but pushed forward. Do you think you can do what you did to the dog to a human? He looked right at Izuku's eyes when he asked. Toshi stood up at that. Now hold up. I was trying to get Izuku to understand animal experimentation is a no-no but you want to jump into human experimentation? My brother is paralyzed from the waist down and there is no one that can fix that but Izuku just might. Iida snapped and then paused. He took in a breath and calmed down. Yes, it could be dangerous and I'm not saying he should go around doing what he did to the dog but he could help. I know it's selfish but it would be just as dangerous as an experimental surgery at the hospital. Izuku spoke right after Iida finished. I think it's okay to be selfish. No one is truly selfless. After that conversation ended, Iida couldn't wait and began to make calls to his family. It wasn't long before others caught wind of what had happened and the staff was made know of the situation. Nezu had asked Izuku for a talk with Nem already waiting in his office. She smiled softly at him and eyed the dog who trotted a step behind him and quietly sniffed around before following Izuku to the couches where Nezu was seated across from Izuku's mother. Nezu watched the dog with interest and then turned his attention to Izuku. Would you please explain what happened? Izuku did so without hesitation. I caught the scent of blood over the wall and found him almost dead. I got close and connected with me. He has some sort of emotional telepathy and pleaded for help. I offered him my help but made sure he understood that it might not work, he wanted it anyway. I was healing him when you called. Now, he better, he said proudly and leaned into Nem's hand as she brushed his messy hair back. Nezu listened without moving and then asked, what injuries did he have? Izuku looked at the mutt and motioned him to stand next to him. The dog did so obediently and stood with his side facing Nezu. He began to point at the dog's body. Most of the lumbar was shattered and some of the lower ribs punctured his organs. The pelvis was mostly okay, legs were broken in a few spots. And he had internal bleeding from the ribs tearing his spleen and small intestinal tract. The dog sniffed his hand pointing and licked it. Nezu nodded along and thought for a moment. He was dead if it wasn't for you. His eyes locked into Izuku's. How did you heal him? The chimera already had an idea how but asked anyway. I paralyzed him with a parasite connected to me and then made an external heart and lungs connected to him. I made him go to sleep with some serotonin in the blood I produced. After that, I mixed my cells with his and had them heal the damage and make him better. My biggest worry was how my cells would react in a foreign body. He looked to Nem. That's why I never asked to donate blood or organs infinitely since I didn't know if my cells would react badly with unknown cells. Then he turned back to Nezu. With the last command I gave them, it seemed to work well. I'm guessing you told the cells to work with the body to survive? Nem said while gently scratching his head. Basically. He nodded. Nezu sighed and rubbed his snout before speaking. Izuku, I'm guessing you aren't aware of my past? When he shook his head, Nezu continued. The short of it is I was captured by a group of scientists and was experimented on for a long time before I managed to escape. And coming to learn you did something similar touched a nerve for me. Just as Nem was going to snap at Nezu, he raised a paw to stop her and continued. I am well aware Izuku is nothing like the scientists and only had good intentions. I just want to make sure Izuku knows not to go too far. It can become a slippery slope, especially with a quirk such as yours. Nezu's mind raced through images of hordes of perfect and adapting biological creatures causing havoc in the streets of Japan. Oh, like those movies we watched, Izuku exclaimed and turned to Nem in understanding. I won't do anything like that. He waved the idea away like it was improbable for him to ever do such a thing. Nezu stared at him for a short moment before moving on. Yes, the other thing I wished to talk about was what the Iida family asked of me. He paused and took his cup of cooling tea for a sip. I can neither condone nor condemn such an action. Doing such a thing as going to a private domicile to perform an advanced medical treatment without any form of training or licensing would be criminal. Izuku stared blankly at the chimera as he tried to process the words spoken to him. What? He tilted his head slightly. While I can't stop you from leaving the school grounds to visit a friend's family on your off time, I can remind you what you do in your free time is not my responsibility. Nezu continued. Izuku grunted in confusion and looked to Nem for help. She only smiled slightly and flicked her eyes towards Nezu. He turned his attention back to him. With that, I hope you have a good day. Nezu smiled and motioned to the door. Izuku looked thoroughly confused at the moment as Nem gently nudged him toward the door. The dog got up from his seated position and trotted behind the two. When outside, Izuku tried to ask his mother what he was talking about, but Nem gently put a finger to his mouth. The feral boy went along with her. The three arrived at Nem's home and she shuffled the two inside. The mutt began to sniff the home and Izuku looked at Nem for permission to talk. When she nodded, he began. Why was Nezu talking like that? Why didn't you let me talk? And can I help Iida's brother walk again? Izuku rapid-fired the questions. Nem placed a hand on Izuku's arm and guided him to a sofa. He diverted his path and sat on the ground to not break her stuff. She began. Izu, what you want to do to Iida's brother is illegal. Doing stuff like you did on, what's his name? She deviated from her explanation and looked at the calm dog looking at them. Izuku looked at the mutt and asked, What's your name? The mutt stared at him and made a connection. He felt confusion and uncertainty from the dog. He didn't have a name, so Izuku offered one. Kane. Short for canine. Kane hopped to his paws and began to wag his tail in joy, and then he howled quietly in acceptance of his new name. Kane nosed at his hand and sat next to Izuku wagging his tail. Nem smiled at the interaction between her son and the dog. Kane. That's a good name. She scratched Kane's neck and then focused back on the previous topic. As I was saying, you need a medical license and a license to use your quirk for medical purposes to do what you did on Kane. You have neither, that's why Nezu couldn't tell you it was okay for you to go perform surgery on Iida's brother. But what you do in your free time and what you tell us happened is all in your hands. She said the last part with heavy implications while maintaining eye contact. Izuku was beginning to understand bit by bit. So, I could get in trouble if I helped Iida's brother, and telling you will get me in trouble, he said slowly. Yes, but it's the weekend. You can go out with your friends and do what teenagers do in their free time. Nem said, smiling and leaning back on the couch. Izuku nodded and stood up. Well, I'm going to play with my friends, he said way too loudly as if someone was listening in on their conversation. Nem snorted and choked back a laugh. She stood with him and pulled him into a hug, which he returned. Equally loudly, she responded. Of course, honey. Go have fun, love you. Kane stared at the two in confusion at their loud voices before following his pack leader out the door. Izuku quickly made his way to the dorms where he found Iida quickly. The taller boy was chewing on his nails and jogging his knee in place. He stood up when Izuku came through the back door. Hello, Iida. Do you want to go and play? Izuku said, still too loudly. Everyone turned to him at such an odd request and loud voice. Iida also looked thrown off, and just as he was going to respond, Izuku kept talking. We should go and play at your house. He tried to make the same eye contact Nem did with him, but it made him look very menacing. Iida reeled back at the actions and looked around in confusion. Then, it all clicked into place. Yes. I would love to invite you to my home where I grew up and my family resides, he said, now equally as loud and stiff. Great. Let's go, Izuku said, beaming and waving at everyone who was staring at the two in confusion. I'm going to play at Iida's house, bye now, he said to the present pack members. The three of them walked out of the dorms and the doors closed behind them. Kachan was the first to explode, of course. What the fuck was that? He looked around for answers. The maid of the boy who just left looked like she was putting together a puzzle. Toshi meanwhile was rubbing his forehead. He turned to Yaoyorozu. You're the smartest, what was all that? He waved at the doors. Yaoyorozu blushed slightly at the compliment and shook her head. I'm not entirely sure. It was as if they were trying to convince us that they weren't going to Iida's household for Izuku to help Iida's brother. Mina jerked up and snapped her fingers, causing Toshi to startle. That's it. They can't tell anyone or else we would have to report them as upstanding hero students that they were committing a medical crime or whatever. Everyone paused and looked at each other. Then Toshi sighed. We need to stop showing Izuku bad movies. He's way too impressionable. Izuku followed a tense Iida to a large house. Kane trotted behind his pack leader and looked around at the suburban neighborhood. Most of the homes were about the same size, but they varied by design. The one they were walking towards was tall with 4 stories and lots of gray and blues in the paint. Izuku politely wiped his paws on the front mat and had Kane copy him. Iida gave them a wry grin as they followed him inside. Mother, father? I am home, with guests, Iida announced into the home. A woman in her mid-50s turned a bend in the hallway. She was tall like her son with graying blue hair and glasses adorned her face. Izuku could see the resemblances between the two in their facial features even though they were softened on her face. She smiled warmly at her son and hugged him tightly in greeting before turning to Izuku. Tenya has told me much about you. I am Nori Iida and the man coming behind me is Takashi Iida, my husband, she said softly just as a tall broad man rounded the same corner. The man had all the features his packmate had. The strong jaw, dark hair, and intelligent eyes. Izuku Kayama, the boy who took down the man who almost killed my oldest. He stared down at Izuku before bowing at the waist. I thank you for doing such a thing and also taking care of Tenya while not at home. Nori followed suit and bowed but not as deeply towards Izuku. Izuku looked between the two and beamed. Of course. He's one of my pack, I'll always take care of him, he said proudly. Behind Izuku, Tenya blushed slightly. The two adults straightened and invited them further into their home. They raised an eye at seeing Kane but didn't stop him from quietly following along. They all went to a living room where Iida's older brother sat on a couch with another older man in his middle years. Bald with thick glasses and a button-up white shirt, he sat across from Tensai Iida. Tenya quickly greeted the old man who turned out to be the family doctor and then warmly greeted his brother. Izuku stood to the side to let his packmate greet his family properly. As they talked a bit, the old man approached him. Greetings, I am Sazama Fumio, the physician of the Iida family. I was made aware that you could help Tensai with your quirk. Hello. I'm Izuku, Iida's pack leader. He paused and hummed as he looked at the family who slightly turned at hearing their name. Tenya, no, Ten. He nodded in acceptance and went on. I'm pretty sure I can. I helped Kane. He motioned to the dog quietly seated at his side. The old man furrowed his brow at the rapid change of subject from one thing to another. Then he turned his attention to the dog. Helped him how? The old man leaned down to observe the dog before letting Kane sniff his hand. May I use my quirk on him? It will not harm him, only a diagnosis. Think of it as a precise CT scan without the magnets. Izuku didn't see the harm in it and nodded. Wait, he told Kane, and he stayed still. Sazama's hands glowed white and they swept through Kane's body between his hands. Each hand was between Kane's head and the light passed into his head and out in rapid succession. The old man hummed in interest as he began to look at Kane with fascination. Kane has a quirk, does he not? Yep. Emotional telepathy or something, Izuku answered easily. The old man stopped and looked up at Izuku. What? Then he must have a mutation that enhances his body. The density in the bone structure is abnormal, and that's not to mention the compressed muscles. Oh, that. I did that. Sazama turned to Izuku at hearing that. How? What is your quirk? Cellwar manipulation. I can change my body to whatever I want. Izuku showed an example by shifting his fingers to claws and tendrils extended from his wrist. Scales extended from his arm and the second pair of eyes opened on his face. Kane forgotten. Sazama got up and took a hold of Izuku's clawed hand and used his quirk on him without asking. My God! Your bones are covered in metal. The tendons are as strong as steel bands and your muscular structure is as dense as cables. He whispered in awe as he slowly rotated his hand and moved slowly up his arm. A cough interrupted Izuku from saying something. He turned to see the Iida family watching them. Nori coughed louder to get Sazama's attention, who was enraptured by the boy's arm. It worked and he jolted away from Izuku's arm. Nori motioned to the couches. Sazama sheepishly nodded and sat with Izuku following and then sitting on the ground. Everyone's eyes went to him at his actions. "I'm really heavy and don't want to break your stuff," Izuku said by explanation. Kane trotted beside him and laid down next to his leg. Tenya began by introducing Izuku to his brother. "Tensai, this is Izuku, class president or pack leader of my class." The two waved happily to each other and Tenya continued. "Yes, well, Izuku's quirk is very fascinating. I'll say." Sazama interrupted. "What is this about?" Tensai said before his mother rebuked the family physician. Tenya cleared his throat and continued. "Izuku, can you please explain?" Izuku beamed and nodded. "Sure, Tenya bashfully smiled at the name. The feral boy explained his quirk and how he developed it to become perfect for his needs in all things. He explained how he studied heavily into human, animal, and quirk biology to help him becoming a hero. Then he explained how he found Kane, how he was on death's door, how he healed him, and how Ten asked if he could do the same to a human. And then, I tricked my pack into believing we were here playing when I came here to heal you," he finished brightly. Everyone was quiet as they processed the story of the energetic young man. It took a full 2 minutes before anyone said anything. "You think you can heal my back?" Tensai asked neutrally. Izuku nodded. "Definitely, I did it on a dog, it's not so different," he said beaming. "Well, that's enough for me. When can we do this?" Tensai clapped his hands nervously and looked around. "Hold on a moment. Tensai, I understand your hurry, but I have to ask if you have any more experience working with such a delicate part of the body such as the spine?" Takashi asked Izuku. Izuku thought about it and said, "Well, I did make mine very flexible." He showed it off by turning over 180 degrees. "Also, I did heal it once when we were at the training camp. I broke it when I was fighting against Muscle Man. I didn't even think about it until now." Everyone in the Iida family looked at each other and one by one nodded and then turned to Sazama. "I'll help in whatever way I can." With his help, everyone turned to Izuku in acceptance of his help. "Great. All I need is a quarter cow or any animal is fine both for energy and mass." He turned to Tensai. "Also, do you want any improvement? Like denser bones, stronger ligaments, or claws?" He offered casually. When Tensai gave him a wry grin like his brother and shook his head, Izuku shrugged. "Your loss." As they prepped a room for the surgery, Izuku just realized he may have created an immortal dog. Looking down at Kane and recalling what command he gave his cells in the dog, keep the dog alive and healthy. Theoretically, Kane could keep living so long as nothing killed him outright, and even then Izuku wasn't sure. Kane looked up at him and wagged his tail at the attention. Izuku shrugged and patted his head. He would just need to alter the command he would tell the cells in the oldest Iida child. The room they were using was a guest room in the Iida household. Currently, Sazama, the family doctor, was sterilizing the room for them to use. Even though Izuku did the same operation on Kane on the wood floors and he was as healthy as he could be, Sazama wanted to be careful. Plastic sheets were spread out and the bed was covered in a hospital's bed sheets. Tenya came up to him watching Sazama work. "Izuku, the meat you requested is here." He motioned to the kitchen. Izuku nodded. He already knew that from the scent but followed along anyway. Kane followed quietly behind. "You sure have a big house," he said absent-mindedly as they walked. Tenya chuckled. "Yes, it was quite spacious and more so when I was younger." He particularly looked at a wall with discolored paint reminded him of running through it when he was a child. "Many fond memories," he said wistfully. They arrived in the kitchen where Tenya's father was setting a large plastic-wrapped package on the kitchen counter. Izuku could smell the fresh blood coming from it. He glanced up at the two boys and motioned to the quarter cow. "How do you want this prepared? It will take some time," Takashi said, unwrapping the plastic. Izuku looked at the man in confusion. "Prepare for what?" The father paused and looked at him. "To cook?" He made a face of realization. "Ooh, it's fine, I'll just eat it now." Izuku waved the idea off. Izuku can eat raw meat due to his immune system, Tenya said by explanation. As far as he knows, he cannot get ill. Takashi looked at Izuku and shrugged. If you're sure, go for it. Izuku nodded with a smile and went up to the slab of meat and bones. Just as he was about to begin, he felt a connection with Kane. He looked at the dog and felt the emotion, hungry. He nodded with tendrils extending and shifting hands to claws. He sliced through a sizable steak with bone and all. He tossed it to Kane and snapped it out of the air with a wagging tail. He trotted off with his meal with an emotion scent of gratitude. After that, Izuku began to dig in. Tendrils extended and began to consume the mass. With breaking bones and tearing flesh. The quarter cow was devoured in a few minutes. The Iida men watched on in disturbed fascination. Takashi had seen many things a retired hero, but seeing a young man devour something almost his size was new to him. Meat, bone, and sinew were all consumed. Tendrils retracted as the meal was just about finished. All that was left was a rib that Izuku was munching on as he savored the meat. I don't think I had beef before. At least not raw. After a moment of thinking, he continued. It's okay, bear is better though. Takashi pushed up his glasses. Well, I can't say I've ever had bear before. He cleared his throat and asked. Are you ready? Do you need anything else? The nervousness was coming off of him in waves and Izuku could smell it on both of the Iida men. The feral boy thought about it and shrugged. I'm pretty sure I can do it now. I didn't really need anything, the cow was just for some extra energy. But I helped Kane without preparing and look at him. He pointed at the dog who was lying down, his tail wagging and gnawing on the remaining bone from his steak. Chunks of bone were stripped off with each pass of his teeth. The Iida men looked at the biologically enhanced dog and then back to Izuku. They relaxed a bit and chatted in the kitchen about other topics. Takashi talked about his work as a retired hero and shared stories about Tenya as a child, much to his embarrassment. Nori and Tensai soon joined the three in small talk and stories, their attempts to forget the illegal and dangerous operation that would happen within the day. Sazama tightened the strings on Izuku's robe and made sure everything was in its proper place. I could have just taken my shirt off. Bacteria and other things don't cling to me very often, Izuku said, and let the physician continue to make sure things were as proper as they could be. Precautions. It's better to be overly careful than not enough, Sazama said. Once done, he stood up and looked Izuku up and down. Good, very good. Let us begin. They moved into the plastic-wrapped room and to Tensai, who was facing down on a bed. His lower back was exposed with the rest of his body covered. Sazama had already given him a slow-acting sedative. Tensai was hooked up to a small heart monitor and an oxygen mask on his mouth. Izuku was already prepped on where they would be operating and the injury location. The spine was made up of many vertebrae, each on top of the other, making a chain of sorts. The vertebrae were grouped up to make things easier. Izuku didn't know the history of it and didn't care too much. The cervical has 7 vertebrae focused on the neck, C1 C7. The thoracic has 12 vertebrae and they make up the length of the ribcage, T1 T1 2. Finally, the lumbar only has 5 vertebrae, L1 L5, and that was where Tensai was hurt. L2 and L3. Sazama reminds Izuku as they approach. I know, Saz, he said with a sigh and moved to the location. Sazama smirked under his mask at the name and applied the local anesthetic to Tensai's lumbar. Setting the syringe aside, he motioned Izuku to begin. The green-haired boy didn't hesitate and had tendrils extending from his shoulders as he felt at the vertebrae. He found the right one, went up one more to L5, and began his second operation. He first created a parasite that would block out the spinal nervous system. What is that? Sazama asked as he watched the parasite get gently placed where Izuku cut. A parasite I created to paralyze opponents. The only difference is that it's still attached to me to make it easier to pull out once I'm done, Izuku said as he cut open the previously scarred area. Tendrils began to snake into the incision, all just as thin as needles. How do you plan to see? The physician was placing his hands in opposite locations to use his quirk to see what was going on. I use my tendrils to feel everything out, and if I need to, I can grow an eye. They stopped talking as they focused on Tensai. Izuku continued to gently tap around where the injured vertebrae were in the spinal column. He began to see what the previous doctors had done to heal him. It made sense that they couldn't heal him properly, otherwise Izuku wouldn't be there. The spinal cord was severed by Stain's sword and torn badly when it was yanked out. Unless the doctors had a form of regenerated quirk, there would be no way to heal him. Luckily, Izuku was there. He began by cutting off the ends of each spinal cord and extracted the material for disposal. Then he slowly began to make the connection to the severed end. One by one, tendrils created nerves, melded them to one open end, and connected to the opposite end. It took some time to find the proper connections. He didn't want to connect the wrong nerve to the wrong end. As he worked, Sazama watched in fascination at Izuku's perfect work. No more than an hour passed and Izuku was done with the spinal cord. With the harder part over, he moved to the surrounding vertebrae. The sword that split his spinal cord also tore through the intervertebral disc, which, for Izuku, was preferable since melding vertebrae back together instead of just healing what was in between would have been harder. The previous doctors already placed an artificial disc there and melded some of the vertebrae where it was fractured. So Izuku tore the disc there and carefully extracted it from Tensai's body. Then he got to work on creating a replacement intervertebral disc. It wasn't too difficult as a tendril went to the middle of where the disc should be and grew to the right size, making the cells copy from another disc to be safe. Between each vertebra, they are connected by facet joints made of bone and ligaments. The previous doctors did a well enough job melding it back to how it should be, but Izuku didn't like their standards. He snaked into the joint and began to heal the bone structure between the fragments. He made sure they had the same quality of bone around them just like Tensai wanted. Finally, the ligament was left and the easiest to construct. He again removed the artificial one placed there by the licensed doctors and quickly created the ligaments between L2 and L3. On his way out of the incision, he closed any cuts he created and healed the opening where dozens of tendrils pulled out. Not even a scar was left as the wound was closed. Izuku let Saz examine the healed area to make sure nothing was left amiss. He stayed connected to the parasite just in case and let Saz give Izuku his input. Saz continued to move around the healed area and stared at where the wound was. It's perfect. Just like any other patient, like it was never torn apart. The old man whispered. He let go of Tensai and rubbed his clean gloves on the area. Not even a scar. Yep. Izuku said proudly behind his mask. Can I pull this out now? He tugged on the tendril connected to Tensai's spine. Sazama nodded and watched as the parasite was extracted and the wound healed. Izuku stood back and looked around at Tensai's prone form. The boy nodded and sat on the ground for a short rest. While he could keep on going for days, it took a lot of mental focus to heal a delicate part of the body such as the spinal cord. If he ever had to work on a brain, he would be drained for the day. Saz looked at Izuku and he looked up at him. What? He asked with his head tilted. You could be the best surgeon in the world, Sazama said. Is there any way I could convince you to change careers? He said hopefully. Thanks, Saz. But no, I want to be a hero. Maybe if I get bored of being a hero I can switch, but I want to hunt bad guys, he said with a beaming smile at the man. He smiled back and nodded. I expected as much, but it was worth a shot. Well, come on, let's give the Idas the good news, he said motioning to the door. Izuku hopped to his paws and joined Saz as he opened the door to the three Idas sitting in the hallway together. They jumped to their feet and looked expectantly at them. Saz removed his mask and smiled reassuringly at them. Saz placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder and said, It went perfectly. I fully believe Tensai will be able to return to hero work as soon as he recovers. And that shouldn't take long either. The Iidas let out sighs of relief and a little sob escaped from Nori at hearing her son would be back to how he was. Takashi hugged his wife and held her close at the news. Tenya smiled gratefully at Izuku and bowed deeply to his friend. The three Iidas gave their thanks to Izuku and Saz for helping Tensai. Saz shoved all the praise onto Izuku since he just watched. Izuku began to get embarrassed at the praise as it mounted and just smiled in acceptance. Izuku stayed over at Tenya's home for the night, both to make sure nothing went wrong with Tensai and also because it was late. While Izuku didn't see anything wrong with that, the Iidas didn't let him leave. After dinner and shower, Izuku laid down on Tenya's bedroom floor in pajamas much too big for him. Kane was asleep by his side and Tenya was softly snoring. Izuku smiled at being able to help one of his pack and fell asleep soundly. Izuku woke up to a panicked scream in the house. Both Izuku and Tenya raced out of the room to find Tensai holding himself up by the kitchen counter with wobbly legs and his mother helping him stand with worry written across her face. Izuku calmed down quickly and Tenya raced forward with his quirk to help his mother with his brother. "I thought something bad happened," Izuku said with a chuckle. "How can he walk? It's been less than 12 hours. Nori asked Izuku as she tried to set Tensai on a chair but he refused to sit. The feral boy shrugged. "I healed him," he said as if that would explain everything. "Kane was hunting with me the next morning and I did more to him than to Tensai." Kane next to Izuku wagged his tail and stuck his chest out with pride. Takashi walked into the room with his phone and rushed to help Tensai who was trying to walk again much to the consternation of his family. "Sazama will be here shortly. Tensai Ida. If you don't sit down this moment." "I can walk. I'm gonna walk." Tensai argued and finally gave up and let his family sit him down with a sigh. He looked up at Izuku and smiled brightly at him. "From the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you ever need anything, I will do everything in my power to help." "Granted, as long as it isn't too illegal." He finished with a laugh and a slap on the arm from Nori and a disappointed look from his father. Izuku beamed and pulled up his pajama bottoms from slipping. He made a small claw on his hip and had it hold it from falling for the third time this morning. "Happy to help one of my pack." Half an hour later, Sazama bustled through the front door and hurried over to Tensai. He asked him questions while he activated his quirk around the previously injured area. Tensai was more than happy to show his limited capabilities, as temporary as they were, to the physician. Sazama watched as he stood up on unsteady legs but he stood on them anyway. Walking a few steps before stopping and being helped to sit down. "Marvelous." And the young man didn't just wave his hand and poof it was fixed, he did it manually. "One severed nerve at a time," Saz said sitting across from Tensai. They looked to Izuku who was struggling to use chopsticks to pick up rice from a bowl. With a face of concentration, he picked up the rice and successfully snatched it before eating it. He looked up as he was chewing and spoke with his mouth full. "What?" Tensai chuckled and shook his head. "Nothing at all. Just talking about how well you healed me." Izuku swallowed the rice and spoke. "You could have been running by now if you let me build up the muscles in your legs and back that atrophied." Tensai looked very interested but Nori cut him off before he could speak. "But there's no need for such. We'll take it one step at a time, right Tensai?" she asked with a pointed look at her oldest son. Said oldest son sighed. "Yes, mother." Sazama stayed for breakfast with the five of them. They talked about mundane things such as the weather or how there was new construction down the road and what would the structure be. It was a peaceful time as Izuku mostly listened to the Iida's talk. "Take care of yourself." Nori kissed the top of Tenya's head as he and Izuku were headed back to the dorms. "Yes, call if you need anything. The both of you," Takashi said looking at Izuku and his youngest. Sazama had already left earlier that day claiming he had more work to do at the clinic. Now, it was just the Iidas giving their farewells to the young men as they left. Tensai was back inside his old room resting from extraneous exercise such as trying to walk to the kitchen on his own. He already gave more thanks to Izuku before they left and gave his number to the feral boy if he ever needed anything. Just as the two young men were turning, Nori grabbed Izuku's hand and placed something in it. "It doesn't come close to what you did for us but I believe good things should be rewarded," she said smiling while patting his arm. Izuku looked at the large clip of money and then up at the two. Not ever being in such a situation, he accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thanks." With that, the two young men and the dog left. Izuku slid a large amount of money into his abdomen for safekeeping and walked happily next to his pack mate who was also just as happy. "Zoo. How was your play date?" Mina asked her mate as the two young men entered the dorms. She was smiling knowingly at them as she patted Kane's head who trotted up to her. Izuku beamed. "It was great. Ten's family was very nice," he said loudly as to convince anyone who was listening. Mina held in a giggle. "That's wonderful," she said just as loud. Tenya smiled at them and made to leave. "I thank you again for visiting my home. If you ever need anything, let me know," he said in a normal volume. Izuku beamed up at him. "K." He went up to Mina and bumped his head with her shoulder in a hug. Mina reciprocated the embrace and their ritual of bumping heads. She let go and hooked arms with him as she dragged him along to the common room. Most of everyone was in the room watching the TV. Two men boxed as the group talked about their fighting style. Kirishima and Sato were especially drawn to the professional boxing match. Izuku was also drawn to the TV as he had never seen the sport. Kirishima glanced over to Izuku as he stared at the men fighting. "Yo, how was Ida's?" he said with a sharp-toothed smile. "Good," Izuku said dismissively and pointed at the TV. "Shima, what's this?" Kirishima tilted his head in confusion and looked between the TV and Izuku. He realized a moment later and beamed at introducing one of the most manly sports to his bro. This is professional boxing. A sport where two opponents hit each other with padded gloves. A few basic rules, but they fight until one can't. Izuku nodded along with the redhead's explanation. "Can anyone do boxing?" Toshi sighed out of his nose with a tired expression. "I swear this will end with someone beaten and bruised by the end of the day," he said under his breath. Jiru by him nodded at his statement. "Of course. Sato and me use boxing techniques in our fighting styles." He pointed over his shoulder with his thumb at Sato behind him. "There are many fighting styles. They would be considered brawlers. I learned martial arts, a different style of fighting," Ojiro added as he watched the boxing match conclude. Kachan spoke up after Ojiro. "Anyone worth their salt has learned a fighting style by now. Unlike you, you feral cat," he said smirking at his old friend. "I can fight," Izuku said defensively. "I'm the best fighter. I even beat Rikamiki. She was supposed to be strong," he said smugly. Everyone turned to Izuku at the completely butchered name of the number 5 hero. "No one is saying you can't fight, it's just you fight like a wild animal," Yaoyorozu said tentatively and finished sheepishly. "Which, to be fair, is a fighting style on its own but." Izuku pouted and pointed at Kachan. "What's your fighting style then?" Kachan smirked and crossed his arms as he raised his chin in superiority. "The Ultra Bomber Murder Special." "Two bems? That sounds dumb," Izuku said plainly. That ignited Kachan both figuratively and literally as he jumped to his feet and yelled. "Huh?" He jabbed a finger at Izuku. "If you didn't have all that shit in your body, I could kick your ass 3 days from Sunday." Izuku looked utterly confused. "Bad words, but what does Thursday have anything to do with fighting?" he said after counting on his hand to make sure he had the right day of the week. He was still very bad at keeping track of time. There were some snickers at Izuku's innocent attitude. "I say we settle this like men." Everyone turned to Sato as he smiled widely. "Fighting ring." He pointed to the backyard. There were many noises of excitement from the gathered class. Izuku and Kachan locked gazes, then bolted to the backyard through the kitchen door. The rest of the class soon scrambled after them with Kane wagging his tail in excitement at what was happening with his pack. "All right. First things first, you need to be handicapped because if you punch anyone, their head will go flying." Kirishima pointed at Izuku. The feral boy nodded with a scrunched-up face. "I could take muscles out?" he offered. Yaoyorozu quickly stepped in and held up a hand. "How about I make some dense weights to restrict your movements?" "That's way easier," Izuku said beaming. "Thanks, Rozu." After some figuring out, the class quickly made a makeshift boxing ring on the grass. Yaoyorozu made boxing gloves for the ones fighting and heavy alloy weights for Izuku. She had to make many pairs for his arms and legs when he revealed that one set wasn't enough. Posts were set in a box and a simple rope tied between them to make the arena. Izuku and Kachan eagerly entered the ring with the class cheering them on. The two shirtless boys grinned animalistic at each other. "All right. Basic rules, nothing below the belt line, and stop when one is down or we say stop." Kirishima acted as referee and looked between the two. When they nodded in understanding, he jumped back and yelled, "Fight!" The two didn't waste time as they charged at each other. Kachan blocked the first punch and swung his fist up at Izuku's unprotected chin. He missed as Izuku slipped back and dove back into close range in a fluid motion. His gloved fist connected with his side and Kachan grunted in pain as he went back to trying and punch his old friend. The next jab from Kachan was a feint as Izuku clumsily blocked it. He felt a strike hit his face as he was trying to figure out how to fight properly. He shook his head at the blow and took another to his stomach as Izuku failed to protect his abdomen. The feral boy growled and looked up at Kachan's smirk. Izuku tried to land a hit once again but was blocked at every swing by the blonde's superior fighting style. It didn't help that his weight was slowed considerably by hundreds of pounds of metal on his arms and legs. When Izuku couldn't land a hit due to Kacchan blocking too well, he powered through the blocks. His fighting style isn't boxing or whatever everyone else learned. So he will use the technique he learned from watching wolves, foxes, and other wild animals fight. He didn't stand and wait for an opportunity to show itself, he moved as fast as he could to make an opportunity. When he couldn't find one, he tried to punch through the blocks Kacchan put up. Bit by bit, Izuku overwhelmed his old friend by quickly moving in, out, and around while not stopping his onslaught of padded hits. He saw a golden opportunity when he saw Kacchan stumble, and Izuku pounced. One padded glove aimed at his head as the other swung at his ribs. He knew Kacchan would block the swing to his head, so the blow was lighter as the punch to the ribs knocked the air out of his friend. Kacchan gulped in air as he took a knee and Kirishima stepped between the two. The class that had been watching cheered and Izuku yelled in victory. He was dripping in sweat just like Kacchan was. The added weight made it extremely difficult for him to move as fluidly as he usually could. He sat on the grass and took in cool air as he breathed. As the two boys took a break, others wanted to try their hand at boxing. Uraraka quickly jumped into the ring and Kaminari followed suit right after. The two gave their boxing gloves to the new fighters as they rolled out of the ring. The match was one-sided as Uraraka didn't hold back against Kaminari, who was taken down by her training from Gunhead. It started lighthearted, but when Kaminari said a cocky comment, Uraraka showed her true skills in hand-to-hand fighting. Kaminari was on the ground groaning in pain as the girls in the class cheered for their champion. "All right, Izuku." Sato pointed at the feral boy who was seated in a crisscross position next to the ring. "You and me. Forget the weights and I use some sugar, what do ya say?" he said, grinning. Izuku grinned just as wide in return and jumped into the ring. He excitedly put on the gloves as Sato was left wearing a white tank top. Kirishima looked between the two nervously, mostly at Sato. The bigger boy took out a packet of sugar and downed it before nodding to show his readiness. Kirishima started the match and leapt back just as Izuku blurred forward. Sato, expecting such a start, put up a defense. Blocking his face, Sato braced from the impact. Izuku went for the block and delivered a heavy uppercut to break Sato's defense. The padded glove hitting skin was loud as Sato endured the blow to everyone's eyes. Then Izuku circled to his right as he delivered another blow to his arm to weaken him. Izuku stopped when Sato tipped over from the last blow and collapsed, unconscious. Everyone was quiet as Sato lay there on the grass. Everyone could see the blood on Sato's gloves from his own mouth where the initial blow connected with enough force to push Sato's arm into his mouth, knocking himself out. Izuku nudged him with his paw and Sato groaned. Everyone let out a sigh of relief at hearing their packmate make a sound. They quickly pulled him from the ring and gave him water as he recovered. "Zuku, you're strong." Sato slurred slightly at the swelling lip. Izuku beamed by his side. "Of course, I am. I'm the pack leader." Everyone chuckled at that but turned their heads at hearing Kane bark. Looking over, the mutt was wagging his tail and seated in the middle of the ring. Expectantly looking at Izuku. The feral boy grinned and obliged the dog as he climbed into the ring once again. The class grinned at the display, but the smiles dimmed as Kane dashed forward faster than any dog had any right to and tackled Izuku to the ground. His teeth were around Izuku's forearm but not biting into the flesh. The feral boy for his part laughed and rolled over to make Kane slip off his paws. He dove at the dog as he recovered quickly and dodged Izuku's attempt to grab him. The boy and dog roughhoused for a while long until a voice was heard from the back door. "What is going on out here?" Tenya said. Everyone froze, including the dog and boy in the ring of churned-up dirt. Izuku was currently under Kane as he held him in a headlock. Kane was on his side huffing breaths as he struggled to get free from his pack leader's hold. "Practice, yay. We're practicing hand-to-hand combat," Kaminari said, not convincing anyone. Kane wanted to try it out as all. Tenya's eyebrow twitched at the obvious lie. "And Sato?" He waved at the large boy with a swollen lip with ice on it. "He lost." "I lost," Kirishima and Sato said at the same time. Tenya looked to Yaoyorozu, who quickly looked away, especially not looking at the boxing gloves with the emblem she imprinted onto everything she made to signify where they came from. The youngest Iida then looked at Izuku in the ring, still frozen, and then shook his head. He rubbed his nose and sighed. "At least wear some head protection," and then he went inside again. As soon as he was gone, Kane and Izuku continued their struggles against one another as the rest of the pack bet on who would end up winning their wrestling match. Of course, Izuku won. Kane lay there panting after a long match and his pack leader had to drag him out of the ring all the while he wagged his tail in happiness at being included. Kane was set down next to Sato, who patted the dog in sympathy. Izuku beat you up too, huh? Sato rubbed Kane's belly. The rest of the weekend was spent with the pack sparring in the ring. Either to settle arguments or to train, mostly to have fun. Everyone who left the ring was bruised and sore but content with the match. Monday came and Aizawa strolled into the classroom. He stopped at the podium and paused when he was going to start talking. He looked over his class. Most everyone had a few bruises scattered around. A few bandaged cuts, a busted lip, and one black eye belonging to Kaminari. The class shifted in their seats when Aizawa continued to stare at them. If I find out your pack of feral brats has been going out and finding trouble, you will be in serious trouble. He finished with a glare at all of them. What? Izuku asked, confused. He patted Kachan's head to get his attention and he turned with a split eyebrow held together with a butterfly band-aid. What's he talking about? Kachan gave him a flat look and then turned back to face ahead when Aizawa spoke to the two. Is there something you'd like to share? Izuku, not fearing anything but Nem's fury, asked. Yay. What are you talking about? Going out and looking for trouble? He said while raising his hand like he was taught to do, even though he had the attention of the tired hero. Aizawa sighed and rubbed his forehead. I suppose you wouldn't know. Vigilantism is when unlicensed people go and try to be heroes. There are rules so that doesn't happen. It would be chaos if every person tried to help with their quirk only for a few quirks to react badly with each other and cause worse damage, or not being trained at all and causing worse damage again. That's why we have trained specialists called heroes to manage the situations, he explained. Oh, good thing we have our licenses, Izuku said, beaming, and everyone turned to look at their pack leader in horror at what he had just said. Aizawa's glare hardened. Izuku Kayama, have you been going out of school grounds to help around? Is that why everyone is injured to some degree, because they followed you along? Izuku tilted his head at the question. Oh, no, I'm not a vigilantism. We made a fight ring in the backyard because Kachan said I didn't know how to fight and I said I did. So we made a ring and I won. After that, everyone else fought each other, even Kane joined in. It was fun, he said in all one long breath that shouldn't have been possible with a normal lung capacity, but Izuku did it. Aizawa's eyebrow twitched as he listened, and then Izuku finished. He just stared at him and the rest of the pack. They sweated under his gaze until he broke it. Now that you have your provisional licenses, you are eligible to work under a pro hero, just like after the sports festival. He continued as if the last 5 minutes didn't happen. These three are the top-ranked students of UA. They will help you understand the difference between these work studies and the ones before. Aizawa waved at the three older students who walked in. Izuku's eyes snapped to the middle boy who had his head down. He sniffed the air and he could smell some tasty snacks he had. Aizawa motioned him to introduce himself, and Izuku could smell the anxiousness coming off of him as he stared at his pack until he turned and placed his head on the wall. He mumbled something that they couldn't hear. The girl takes the lead, and instead of introducing herself, she flits around the classroom and questioned the members of the pack like Shoji's mask, Mina's horns, Todoroki's burn, and finally Izuku's horns and legs. None of them had a chance to answer as she jumped to the next person like an excited child. These guys are weirder than Izuku is, Toshi said out loud to many, agreeing with the statement. Najire, as she introduced herself as she floated around with her quirk, paused at examining Izuku's horns and turned to them. Everyone is a bit weird, you have to be to make it big, she pronounced with hands thrown into the air. Mirio, as he introduced himself, tries to do some kind of motivational speaker routine in which the speaker says something and then the audience says something in unison in return. None of that happens as he moves on from his weird behavior. Well, the point of all this is to show you the differences between newly licensed students to experienced students. So how about this, we'll fight and show you the difference between us, 20 versus me, he said, smiling. Isn't the difference between us that you have experience and we don't? Izuku asked innocently. Mirio's smile faltered a bit, but he didn't let that slow him down. Yes. But how can you see that? He asked. Izuku pointed at all of them. You guys are ready to fight even though we are in school. The three older students started at his proclamation. The three older students looked at each other. Well, yes, Mirio said with his sails blown down. I'm the best at noticing things, Izuku said proudly. The class snorted at his usual antics of being the best at whatever he said he was at. Yes, you notice all the things, Toshi said sarcastically. Mirio looked at the class he was supposed to talk to and then Aizawa, who looked already used to their behavior. He motioned him to focus on the class again and he did so. Well, no matter. Let's go and show you the difference between us, Mirio exclaimed and turned to leave. The class looked at each other and shrugged. They got up and followed the odd older teen. Mina hooked arms with Izuku as they walked and bumped heads together as they chatted about the weird teens that showed up. Izuku and his pack stood in the gym with Mirio across from them. He was casually stretching a bit more than should be possible as he twisted his torso almost 180 degrees around his waist. All the while bones popped as Izuku sighed in relief at the good stretch. We've got this, it's 20 on 1, Kaminari said cockily while he crossed his arms. Kachan slapped the back of his head with a scoff of derision. You think 20 of us can take on our feral class president if he tried? No, so don't underestimate Sunshine over there. He nodded toward Mirio who was beaming a smile. Ooh, Kachan, was that a compliment? Toshi said snickering. He dodged the grasping hand as he chuckled all the while. Shut it, troll hair! Kachan yelled. Mirio clapped his hands and rubbed them together. All right, you all can start whenever. Watch and learn, nerds, Kachan said as he blasted forward toward a still Mirio. The first blast tore the clothes away to show Mirio still standing there, undamaged and nude. Most of the pack yelped in surprise and covered their eyes reflexively. Most of the guys used to Izuku's casual nudity in the locker room, ignored it and focused on how Mirio escaped the blast. Kachan's trajectory was skewed from the missed blast and he veered off course. Mirio took the opportunity to dash forward while sinking into the ground like a buggy game. He erupted fist first into the gathered first years with blinding speed. No attacks landed on him as he dashed between each one of them and left them on the ground. Todoroki managed to last a bit longer as he propelled himself into the air with an ice pillar, but Mirio swam up the ice like it was liquid and brought him next to his packmates. Izuku hummed in thought as he watched Mirio devastate his pack. He can turn in. Not being able to be touched, he said, giving up on the word. He crossed his arms as Todoroki was taken out and Mirio disappeared. He's fast too, he finished saying as Mirio appeared under him with a fake out by going to poke his eyes out. Izuku didn't hesitate and swung his fist with all his might as he ignored the idea of his eyes needing to be regrown. His fist phased through Mirio, but it caused him to stumble for a moment. His other hand phased through his face as well, the attack forgotten. Mirio's top half appeared farther away as he stared at Izuku. How did you know the hand going for your eyes wasn't going to hit? The feral boy shrugged. I didn't, I was just planning to regrow them with the benefit of breaking a few of your ribs, maybe a ruptured organ or two with my punch. Oh ho. A regenerating quirk. How tricky. Mirio clapped and disappeared just as Kachan landed an explosion where he was a moment ago. Kachan snarled in agitation as Mirio disappeared. He guessed his target was Izuku, so he flew over there just in time to see him appear behind Izuku with a strike to his side. Without hesitation, Izuku swung his hand back like an axe but phased through his neck. With a more animalistic growl coming from Izuku, Mirio disappeared just as Kachan arrived too late again. He yelled in annoyance. I don't like fighting him, it's annoying. Izuku snarled as he was crouched down and ready to strike. You and me both, Kachan said, his back to his in a similar position. The upperclassman appeared just like before. He was shaking his hand as if to get rid of the pain. What are you made of? He chuckled. Quit running away, you coward, Kachan yelled but didn't waste time chasing him down. Regeneration quirks are always a war of attrition. Mirio wagged his finger like he was an old man lecturing children. He stopped when he heard bones crack and flesh tear. He was just fast enough to make his body intangible as a bolt of bone shot through his shoulder. He looked up from the bolt to see a biological crossbow on Izuku's arm with tendrils loading another bolt. That's not regeneration. You assume, Izuku growled in frustration at missing. His second pair of eyes opened and glared just as hard as his original pair. His other arm shifted into a bone whip and he swung it overhand at Mirio. He disappeared once again. "You little rat," he yelled in anger. He appeared under Izuku and knocked the legs under him as Kacchan blasted him to no effect. Izuku didn't stop his attempt to attack as the whip lashed the air where Mirio was with terrible force. The air cracked as the whip caught nothing. Claws raked Mirio as he punched Kacchan and it was ineffective just like everything else. Mirio disappeared once again as Kacchan held his shoulder in pain. "You little shit. Come back here," Kacchan yelled. "Fine. Fight how you want," Izuku growled as his body shifted. His shirt was torn apart as quills extended from his body in every direction. They shuddered as they took their place and Izuku shifted into his hunter's form. "Don't touch the quills, Kacchan," the hunter said in a dozen voices. Kacchan looked at the quills and they were shiny like they were wet. "That better not be fatal," he growled. "Probably not, first time trying it." His sharp teeth showed a vicious smile. "You look terrifying," Mirio shouted from a distance but smiled nonetheless. "Still, let's see what you've got," and he disappeared again. This time Mirio came from the side and with one swift strike took out Kacchan. As he went limp, Izuku's tendrils and claws raked through Mirio in a futile attempt to get some sort of damage in. With a frustrating growl, Izuku stopped and concentrated for a moment, and then his body opened large pores. The hole spewed out a purple gas at Mirio. He gasped and sunk into the ground only to re-emerge coughing violently and stumbled when he tried to catch himself. He had to sink into the ground in a panic as Izuku pounced with claws outstretched to grab him. He only managed to rake the concrete. Looking around furiously, he found Mirio emerging and then staying still where he lay there. The hunter spear point tail hung over Mirio's head. "I win," a dozen voices pronounced with a vicious grin. Then he roared in triumph as his standing packmates cheered him on. "I demand a trophy," he said raising his fist in the air. Aizawa walked up to them in a brisk walk and checked on the prone student who was yet to speak a word with his body limp. He checked his pulse and breathing. He then looked up at Izuku. "What was that gas?" Izuku looked around until he found Mirio's clothes. He ignored the two upperclassmen who ran up to Mirio in worry. A paralytic derived from a poison dart frog made into a gas with the help of Nem. Its potency was adjusted for a non-lethal takedown. A dozen voices explained as he crouched down and took the shoes of the paralytic student. "Yes." Mirio slurred something intelligible as he tried to lift his arm unsuccessful. His friends tried to sit him up but he flopped limp. "When is this supposed to wear off?" Najire asked worriedly. She also ran over and grabbed his shirt to cover him from being nude. Izuku shrugged. "First time trying it, a few hours at most." Aizawa rubbed his forehead and typed out a message to someone on his phone then put it away. "I'll have Recovery Girl look at him." He turned to Izuku's looming hunter form which was taller than him. He glared at the demonic face of the young man. "When you develop a new method of subduing an opponent, test it in a controlled environment. Especially when the method is poison." Izuku tilted his head like a puppy confused. "But this is a controlled environment," a dozen voices rumbled out. Aizawa sighed and looked to the heavens for help. "Not in a live combat situation." He said it as if it was obvious. Izuku shrugged. "K." Aizawa turned from the hunter and addressed the rest of the pack who were closer now. "Think upon a work study. Reach out, you are not limited to your previous internship. Some might take you back, others don't want to see you Hellions again. Dismissed." He waved them off as a pair of robots came with a stretcher between the two. Bones cracked and flesh shifted as Izuku was back to his short self. He clutched his new trophies as he joined his pack to change out of their uniform. He showed off the shoes to Mina who smiled at his happiness. Kacchan grumbled about losing to the upperclassmen but was still proud he lasted longer than the rest. When school ended, Izuku and his pack headed back to the dorms. The feral boy deviated from them and ran to his den to place his newest trophy on his shelves. The shoes were simple but he only saw a worthy fight and victory. He smiled in pride and pulled his phone out as Kane ran up to greet his pack leader. Izuku patted the dog as they walked and he dialed his mentor. "Pup. Good to hear from you. How have you been?" Gang Orca greeted Izuku happily. "Gang. I'm great. How are you?" Izuku greeted him just as happy. Gang chuckled on the other end with some mirth. Good, good. What brought up the call? Not that I'm happy to hear from you," he finished hastily. Zawa was saying something about work studies and how they were like internships. Can I come back and work with you again? He asked hopefully. But of course. You are more than welcome back. But are you sure you don't want to branch out and try a different hero? Maybe someone who specializes in search and rescue or an investigation hero. It's always good to have options. Izuku hummed in thought. The idea of working with the wild pussy cats was appealing since they worked in the forest some of the time. He liked Gang Orca more. He also thought about investigation heroes and dismissed the thought. Gang already did some combat and he liked the ocean. Maybe there would be an ocean villain they could fight, that seemed like fun. Nope. I want to go with you, he said confidently. The smile could almost be heard as he spoke. Wonderful. I'll start up the paperwork. From what I can remember, all you need is to come drop what you need and we'll be set. I'll ask around for the paperwork. Thanks, Gang. Izuku beamed as he reached the back door of the dorms. Of course, pup. I'll see you soon, Gang said warmly. Izuku hung up and went inside with Kane behind him. He went to his packmates in the common room. Some were doing homework and others lay around being lazy. Izuku found his mate on her phone and chatted with Hagakure. He went and sat at her feet and leaned into her as she stroked his hair like he liked. He turned to Yaoyorozu since she was the smartest and asked, Rozu, what do you need for the work studies? Yaoyorozu looked up from her homework and thought for a moment before speaking. I believe a few signed sheets from Aizawa and return to him from whoever you will be working with. You already have a work study lined up? She asked surprised. Yep, with Gang. I just called and asked him, he said beaming. Mina brushed his hair back so he would look at her upside down. Ooh, can I come too? I always wanted to meet him. Izuku smiled warmly to his mate. Of course, you can always come with me anywhere. Mina's face bloomed purple at the declaration and heated even further when her packmates, ooh, at the words. She hid her face in his hair until her blush receded enough. You can't just say stuff like that, she whispered embarrassed. Izuku beamed at her and leaned further into her as he felt warmth in his chest at being so close to his pack. The rest of the day passed quickly with Uraraka and Tsuyu getting invited to Ryukyu's agency by Najire and Kirishima getting invited to Fatgum's agency by Tamaki. Tokiyami also mentioned Hawks was open for him to come back to his agency. The night came and everyone went to their rooms to sleep. Mina grabbed Izuku before he could leave for his den. She blushed as she asked him, do you want to sleep together? I mean sleep in the same bed? Not. She blushed furiously as she left the rest unsaid. Izuku tilted his head and then smiled. Okay. But your bed won't hold my weight. He was happy to sleep with his mate. My bed is stronger. She smiled and nodded with a faint blush. Okay, I'll meet you in your room. Izuku went to his room and looked around. He rarely used it. Only to keep his clothes, books, and some other things Nem bought for him. The bed was practically new with him using it once or twice at most. He was already in his sleepwear, sports shorts, and a tank top. There was a quiet knock at his door and Izuku opened it to see Mina in her pajamas and holding a pillow. She smiled shyly at him and walked in. She hugged him before settling under the bed covers. Good night, Zu. She pecked his cheek and burrowed into the covers. Night, Mina. He said hugging her as they drifted off to sleep with their legs intertwined. The next day, Izuku and Mina walked hand in hand to Gang Orca's agency with Kane at their side. They rode the same train Izuku did for his internship after the sports festival and he somewhat remembered the path. Mina and he chatted as they walked down the sidewalk to the familiar building. Kane sniffed everything he saw of interest but stuck close to the two. She took the nice ocean-themed entrance and walked in with Izuku. The receptionist recognized him immediately and sent him to Gang Orca's office with a smile. Mina got a guest pass and they quickly went up to his office. On the way, a few of his sidekicks greeted him with exuberance at seeing him again and one with dread as she remembered being carried 30 feet into the air by him in the provisional license exam. Kane of course got many pats on his head on the way. Gang. I'm here, Izuku said into the open doorway to his office. The large man looked up from his paperwork with a smile. Izuku. Come in, come in. He saw who was behind him and smiled even wider. And who's this? Izuku pulled Mina by her hand and presented her proudly. This is Mina, my mate, he said beaming and then he motioned to Kane. And this is Kane. I found him. Mina blushed slightly at the introduction but bowed in greeting and smiled. I've always wanted to meet you, Mr. Orca. Gang laughed a belly laugh and motioned them in. Nice to meet you too, Miss Mina. Please. Call me Gang like Izuku does here. I quite like it. And you found him? He looked at Kane who was sniffing him. He offered a hand and the mud licked it before moving on. Yep. He was dying so I healed him. Now he's part of my pack, Izuku said simply. Gang paused at that and looked closely at the healthy dog. His fur was long but clean, with no obvious wounds, and very clean teeth when he caught a glance. Healed him how? He raised a brow at Izuku. Izuku went on to explain the whole story of him finding Kane hurt and asking for help. His experimental healing procedure and subsequent success. He left out his involvement in healing Tenya's brother because that was illegal. Also, he has an emotional telepathy quirk. He added as an afterthought. Gang let out a long sigh and rubbed his bald head. Well, that's one hell of a story. You can heal others, that's incredible. Bad word. Right. Gang smiled. Well, I can say you keep surprising me at every turn. From being able to grow wings, beating Mirko, and now healing others. You'll be a great hero, Gang said warmly. Izuku felt warmth fill his chest and Mina patted his hand with hers with an encouraging smile. Thanks, Gang. Well, I suppose we should get that paperwork done. The hero clapped his hands and grabbed a pen. Half an hour later, a group picture for Mina, and they were headed out of the agency. Since they had time, Mina wanted to explore the area and maybe find a good restaurant for them to eat at. Izuku was more than happy to go with her plan as they walked aimlessly through the streets and stopped at any shop they found interesting. Kane happily trotted beside them. I swear I heard there was supposed to be a good pastry shop around here, Mina complained. She was pulling her phone out and looking around at the building. Izuku, not having a sense of direction to save his life in the city, let her deal with them being lost. Meanwhile, he looked around at the quieter place in the city. Kane was nearby sniffing the area and perked up when he caught a scent. The mutt rounded a corner in an alleyway and Izuku tugged Mina to see what Kane found. Kane was sniffing something behind a stack of boxes and barked at Izuku before turning back. Izuku's senses were turned pretty low since he didn't like the city smell, so he only caught the scent of old and fresh blood mixed in. A small child was cowering behind the boxes, trepidation obvious on her face at the strangers. She had silver hair and one horn poking out the side of her forehead. You're hurt, that's a lot of blood. Izuku frowned and knelt by Kane, sensing her obvious discomfort and fear. Mina gasped slightly at seeing the child in such a state. She quieted when the child flinched. It's okay, are you hurt? Help, please. The girl began to cry. Kane's hackles rose and he lowered his body, turning deeper into the alleyway. He growled in a low menacing tone as he connected to Izuku. He sent danger and blood through the connection. Izuku rose from his crouch as he put himself between his mate and whoever was coming. What a waste of time. It's time to find a new supplier and that cursed child. A voice was heard as footsteps rounded the alleyway. Run. The child pleaded. Mina grabbed the girl and pulled her into her arms as she kept an eye on where Izuku was watching. She wondered if encountering villains on their days off was due to Izuku's bad luck or hers. Mina held the shivering girl to her chest as she backed away from the footsteps. She kept an eye on the entrance of the alleyway just as she was trained and pulled her phone out to call for help. Whether or not Izuku could beat whoever the girl was hiding from, they needed to call this in. And since they didn't have access to the appropriate channels, she called Izuku's adoptive mother. What are you doing with my daughter? The man with the bird mask asked Izuku. His eyes flickered from him to Kane to Mina and the child in her arms. Izuku's eyes took in the man as he stopped in front of them. She was hiding and scared from someone. His posture was lower to the ground and ready to pounce at a moment's notice. Ah, yes. She is afraid of punishment after disobeying me and running away once again. Give her to me, the man said as he pulled off his gloves. Kane growled and Izuku agreed with his packmate. While he didn't sense a lie, he sensed malice radiating off of him in waves. Why does she have bandages like that? Only hurt people wear those. Izuku opened an eye on the back of his neck to help Mina keep an eye on their backs. Don't you know it's inappropriate to ask questions like that? The increasingly annoyed man asked. No, I don't. I'm still learning. Are you the one that hurt her? Izuku said honestly. The man turned from him and looked at the child. Eri, come here now. or there will be more severe consequences. No, I don't think so. You give me the capital B bad vibe, Mina said as she continued to back away from them. It's alright, Izu is strong, she said more quietly to Eri. No, he'll kill you, Eri said crying. You've made your choice, the villain said as he slapped his hand on the alleyway wall. Dozens of stone spears shot out of the wall to impale Izuku and Kane where they stood. Izuku didn't have to tell Kane to get under him as he formed bone shields on his arms. The spears impacted with enough force to crack the reinforced bones. Kane shot out from under Izuku's legs and pounced, aiming for the villain's neck. He managed to put up his other arm in the way of the jaws just in time to save himself from being killed, but his arm was ravaged by Kane's enhanced jaws and fangs. Kane ripped his head to the side and tore a chunk of muscle and flesh with the movement. A hand moved to touch Kane's head, but a bone bolt shot the hand and pinned it to his chest. He screamed in pain and anger as he watched Eri disappear around the alleyway with Mina carrying her. He used his quirk on himself to heal the hand and the missing chunk of flesh in an instant as Izuku lunged at him with claws outstretched to grab him. Not expecting the limbs to be healed, he couldn't dodge the villain's hand touching Izuku's outstretched hand. It all happened in an instant, but it felt like everything slowed down for Izuku as he felt something wanting to change his body without his instruction. The body which he had control over all his life was beginning to turn into a bloody mist. It began when the villain touched him and traveled up his arm to his chest. Izuku forced his will to stop the process. His body was his quirk and he controlled his quirk, no one else did, only him. Cells came apart under the villain's command and they stopped under Izuku's will. The walls of the alleyway were painted red from Izuku's arm exploding. From halfway down his bicep, it was a bloody stump. He roared in pain at the missing limb and quickly shut down the nerves that were severed. He lashed out with his whole arm at the man who took his arm and raked his claws across his eyes. More blood splattered the alleyway as the villain reeled back in pain. He slapped his hand on the ground as he hit it and stone spikes shot out at the pair. Kane was hit in the back leg and Izuku took a spike in the abdomen, but he healed that quickly. He grabbed Kane's mangled leg and fixed it without waiting for Kane to brace for the pain. He yelped in pain, but he was whole again. Izuku glanced back and worried that if there was one villain, there could be more. He looked at Kane and trusted the mutt. Protect Mina, Izuku ordered and pointed out of the alleyway. He didn't know where they went, but he wanted to make sure she would be safe. Kane hesitated but followed his pack leader's command. He rushed out of the alleyway and followed the scent of the mate of his pack leader. Izuku turned back to the villain just as Kane rounded the corner. The villain's eyes were healed just like his arms. You should have just given her to me, but now I will make sure you suffer. You aren't the only one that can heal. Izuku had a tendril shoot out of his stump and touch the blood smeared across the walls and floor. Each cell connected back to him in an impossible spiderweb and came under his control. All the blood, bone, and other organic bits followed his direction just like they were in his body and sucked back into the shapeless form of a limb. The mass of blood and bone solidified under his command and split into long tendrils with the bones acting as bladed tips. The villain looked on in disgusted fascination as the blood came together into the shape of an arm and then split into razor weapons. You are filled with sickness. He spat out and slapped his hands on the ground. I can't get sick. Izuku challenged back and leapt over the wall of stone spikes. His blood arm shot out and dozens of blood tendrils pierced through the villain's arms to neutralize his quirk. The villain yelled in pain as he reformed his arms whole once again and looked up to see Izuku descend from his perch on the alleyway wall with a whip of blood slicing down. One arm flew away as he landed on the villain. He grabbed his other arm at the same time and prepared himself to cut it off and continue the fight when nothing happened. His paw pinned down the stump of his other arm and he held the other hand with his good arm. The blood arm was shaped into a large blade posed to slice anything that he deemed dangerous, but it was unnecessary as the villain was defeated. Just like Shitaki's and Raka's quirks, you need to use your hands, Izuku said on top of the villain, not letting go. He formed a tourniquet from the villain's belt and stopped him from bleeding out while keeping an ironclad grip on his other hand. Izuku's pupils dilated like a cat as he focused on his mask. He quickly looked around and then in a fluid motion, he grabbed it with a tendril and pulled it into his abdomen where he had just enough space for smaller trophies. He grinned and began to drag the now unconscious villain to the alleyway exit. He sniffed the air and paused. He recognized that scent but couldn't remember from where he knew it. Then a figure dropped from the rooftop and stood in front of Izuku and his prey. She stood up in all her 5 feet 2 inches glory and smirked at Izuku. Well, well, well. What do we got here? Kinda sloppy if you ask me. Mirko looked at the unconscious villain being dragged face down behind him. Rimikimi, we meet again, Izuku said, raising his chin in superiority. I see you've healed from your loss. Mirko's face contorted in anger. Huh? Loss? You are the one who lost, and what did you call me? Izuku used the villain's remaining hand to point at the number 5 hero like it was his own. I was the last one standing. You had to be carted away, he said smugly, and I called you by your name. My name is Mirko. She yelled and slapped the villain's hand away from her. I wasn't carted away. I was retrained to save your ass from being continuously beaten into a bloody pulp, like that arm, she said smirking. Bad word. And I can keep fighting even if I am a bloody pulp, he said and showed off by moving his blood arm and forming it into a semblance of an arm. Last time I saw you had a broken leg and I was still standing. So I win, he said while crossing his arms in finality, all the while never letting go of the villain's hand. Mirko was about to retort when she heard sirens. Right, better do my job and all that. She pulled out quirk-suppressing handcuffs, putting one on the villain's remaining arm and then paused. Well, shit. She looked at the stump. Bad word. Izuku flicked her ear and took the other handcuff. He clipped it around his ankle and nodded. There. I swear. She glared at Izuku. I know, it's bad. He ignored her in favor of looking for his mate and Kane. He became a bit worried when he didn't see them immediately. He pulled his phone out and dialed Mina. The phone rang for a moment before relief filled him when she picked up. Izuku. What happened? Are you all right? Where are you? I found a police station and they said they sent out the signal. Mina said in rapid fire. I began to worry when Kane found us alone. Izuku smiled. I'm okay, Mikimi. Mirko found me after beating the villain and the police are coming now. The hero was grabbing his horns in frustration at being called things that weren't her name. He went with it since he didn't smell any malicious intentions coming from her. Okay, I'll see you soon, Mina said in clear relief as well. With that, he hung up and at the same time detached his horns at the base. The bunny hero stumbled and then dumbly looked at the horns in her hands and then up at Izuku who was grinning at her. She let go of the horns and they dropped to the sidewalk. Hey. My horns. Izuku dove to grab them and then place them back where they were supposed to go. He twisted them until they lined up where they sealed back seamlessly with the nubs. Mirko shook her head and waved down the police cars that appeared. Come on, Brett. You have some explaining to do. She began to walk and then pause. Looking back at him, she asked. You passed that exam, right? Izuku tilted his head. Which one? Oh, that license thing. Yep, I passed. He said beaming and his provisional license emerged from his forearm and slid to his hand to hold out to her. She didn't bat an eye at the display and nodded. Good, otherwise this would have been a pain in the tail. After talking to a few police officers and telling them the reason why he used his quirk and why the alleyway was destroyed, he was escorted to the police station where Mina was with Kane and the child. Mirko followed him since the villain was restrained and was being escorted by a couple of police cars and a few heroes who showed up at the scene. They asked him if he needed any medical assistance but he declined. His clothes were torn up but he didn't care too much about them. As for his arm, he was reminded of the last time he lost the same arm to a different villain. Luckily, he had all the material he needed in the mass of blood and gore he had condensed into the shape of an arm. It was still in a liquid form but it shouldn't take weeks for him to reconstitute it. Izuku followed Mirko through the front doors of the police station into a room. Opening the door showed Mina seated with Kane at her side. Gang Orca was kneeling in front of Eri who was being cleaned up by his gentle hand. She had a new shirt on and shorts to replace the rags she was found with. The little girl flinched when the door opened and again when Mina stood up to see her mate. Izuku. She ran up to him and hugged him fiercely. If he didn't have reinforced bones, she would have squeezed the air out of him. I was so worried, she said quietly. Izuku hugged her back, sinking into the warmth she gave him. I'm okay. I wouldn't call missing an arm okay, Gang said from his kneeling position. Mina reeled back and gasped at his blood and gore arm. What happened? Overhaul did that. Eri spoke for the first time. She was looking down and was beginning to cry. I'm sorry. That villain? Yep, but it's fine. I can grow it back easily. All the stuff is still there, so. Izuku shrugged. But he's gone now. He thought of the trophy he got from him and hummed in satisfaction. Mina narrowed her eyes at him when she recognized that noise coming from him, but she didn't say anything. Kane trotted up to him and sniffed his arm before sitting before Izuku. He looked up at him proudly. The pack leader patted his head in thanks for protecting his mate. Izuku went to the little girl who was looking at him and still comprehending what he said before. He's gone. The feral boy squared down next to Gang and nodded. Yep. Some police people came and took him away. Probably to a hospital. I took off one of his hands, then jail. Right? He looked to Gang. Izuku. The large hero said in a scolding tone. He shrunk back slightly at the scolding tone. He wasn't sure if it was because he cut off a hand or because he was saying stuff that wasn't appropriate for a child to hear. What? Gang let out a sigh and shook his head. Yes, Overhaul, as you called him, will be seen by medical and then transported to a holding facility until we investigate everything more thoroughly. Mirko, who was leaning back on two legs of the chair she sat on, asked. Overhaul? Never heard of him. What did he do? She waved at Izuku's arm. He can take things apart and put them back together, Eri said quietly. He used it on me a lot. The room became quiet and the two heroes flinched violently when they felt Izuku react to hearing that. He didn't move, but his presence slipped out of his control and they felt bottomless anger until it was sealed once again. Mirko had frozen and her ears flattened on her head as Gang Orca reeled back from Izuku. Sorry, he said quietly. He turned to Eri and spoke softly. You don't have to worry about that anymore. He said, smiling. He turned to the heroes who were still recovering from his outburst. So, now what? Gang cleared his throat to compose himself and explained. Well, we report everything that has happened. Get statements from everyone involved and get little Eri here somewhere safe. He turned to her and asked. Do you know where your parents are? Any family? Eri looked down and away as she sniffed. Mama didn't want me because of my curse. Izuku felt a pang in his chest at the similarities between the two. Gang asked. What do you mean? Your quirk. It made Papa disappear and Mama gave me to them. Eri began to cry again. He called it a curse. Kane trotted up to Eri and laid his head on her lap in an attempt to comfort her. She was startled at first, then slowly calmed down with Kane's weight on her legs. My mother didn't want me either. Except she didn't want me because I didn't have a quirk. But everything turned out all right. You'll be the same. Izuku said confidently and smiled at the little girl. Eri looked at Izuku and asked, what did she do? Oh, she left me in the woods when I was about your age, I think. I'm not good with time. Izuku said casually. What? Mirko exclaimed in surprise. Oh, Eri said. Izuku patted her silver white hair with his normal hand. Everything will be fine. And then he stood up with a stretch, joints popped and muscles stretched. Izuku is right, we'll figure this out. Don't you worry. Gang smiled at the little girl. He turned to Izuku. As for you, get some clothes on. He looked down at his shirt, which was full of holes and the bottom half was missing. Forgot about that. Luckily his shorts were whole. I should wear Auntie Suki's clothes. Yeah, you probably should. Come on, let's get you a shirt. Mina snorted and whipped her face clean of tears. She held his hand tight as she guided him to where the clothes were. She looked over at him and the missing arm. Staring for a bit too long, she added on. Nem probably isn't going to be happy. Izuku experienced dread for the first time in a very long time and looked at his mate. You told her? She was right. Nem would give Izuku another lecture just like she did when they were shopping at the mall. Mina giggled at his obvious reaction. Oh, calm down, it won't be that bad. Probably. She turned back to where they were headed. Probably. No answer. Mina. Probably. He was dragged to the room where clothes were stored for all shapes and sizes. He whined all the way there at the upcoming lecture. Izuku. Come down this instant. Nomori shouted up to the roof. Don't make me come up there. The feral beast named Izuku hid on the rooftop from his mother's scolding with his mate laughing at his misfortune. No? You're gonna yell at me, he said while peeking over the edge of the roof to look down on Mina holding her hand to her mouth in obvious amusement, his mom with her hand on her hips looking up at him, and Gang watching on in amusement at the scene before him. Mina held in a wheezing laugh at her mate's words. Izu, you're making worse out to be than it is. Right, Nem? She looked over at Nem. She sighed and rubbed her forehead. Yes, baby. I'm not mad at you, just at your bad luck at being out in public and always getting into trouble. I'm not upset you helped the kid, just that you ended up getting hurt. Izuku tentatively peeked more over the roof until he saw his mother's clear distress. He jumped down from the roof of the police station and landed with a quiet thump. He felt a mixture of shame and anxiety in waiting how his mother would react. He felt immediate relief when he was brought into a tight hug by Nem. The shame lingered even afterward because in that small moment when he leapt down he saw the stress in her face caused by his actions. He didn't want to cause her stress. I'm sorry, he mumbled into her sweater while he hugged her in return. She pulled him away and caressed his face. Seeing the clear shame in his expression, she asked, "What do you have to be sorry for? You did nothing wrong. You helped a hurt little girl get away from an evil man and find solid evidence for a drug manufacturing ring to be brought down," she said, smiling at him. Looking at her smile, he told her, "I don't want to stress you and stuff." Izuku was startled by the laughter that Nem released suddenly. She brought him into a hug even tighter than before. "Oh, sweetie. The only way a mother would stop stressing over their child's safety is if they locked them up in a padded home, and I wouldn't ever do that to you. It's inevitable for a child to stress their mother out, and that's part of life. You don't ever have to worry about me. All I care about is you coming home safe." She finished by kissing the top of his head between his horns. The feral boy felt tears crop the corner of his eyes at his mother's words and care for him. He sniffed once before nodding at her words. "Even then, I'll be more careful. That's all I can ask for." Nem brushed his hair into a semblance of something but let it poof out again in futility. Ooh. Mina couldn't hold herself back and hugged them both at the sweet moment. Izuku didn't waste any time and hugged her and Nem in a group hug while Nem was surprised for a moment before returning the hug. Gang Orca at the side wiped his eyes from the moisture that built up suddenly and Kane let out a low howl. He padded up to the three and bumped his head into their legs. Nem chuckled once more and reached down without looking to pat the dog. After collecting themselves, Nem looked to Gang. Is everything settled on their side? She nodded to the police station where they came from. Gang nodded. Yes, Eri has already been moved to a secure medical facility with Mirko acting as guard for the time being. As for the paperwork, it should be nearly finished but nothing needs their input, he explained. Good, I think that was enough excitement for the day, Mina said while stretching her arms. I want to go home. Izuku agreed with his mate and Nem motioned them to the car waiting for them. Then, let's get going. Thanks again, Gang Orca, for looking out for Izuku, she said to the large man. Think nothing of it, I am more than happy to have Izuku under my fin, he said, smiling at the feral boy who grumbled while poking his arm that was an amalgamation of blood and gore. Mina was also looking at it and was tempted to copy her mate in prodding the arm held together by wool alone. I believe it will be an enjoyable time, he said, grinning even more. The four of them got into the car with Kane lying on their feet. Izuku relaxed in the back seat with Mina leaning on him with their hands intertwined. While leaning against each other, Izuku focused on his blood-amalgamated arm and scanned for everything he had in it. He still grumbled at having to reconstitute the same arm that was ashed at the summer camp. Just about everything was there except some bone and steel that he assumed got displaced in the explosion of his arm. There were probably fragments of his arm still back in the alleyway that didn't connect when he pulled the blood back together. He shrugged at the loss, he could manage without it. The arm looked like it began to swirl and jerk inside the container of his will as parts began to go where they belonged. Bone was yanked from its free-floating state into where it resembled the humerus and then the ulna and radius, with bits of bone lining up the fingers and smaller bones in his hand. They soon melded together into actual bones and ligaments formed between each one. Tendons connected them in the right places and then the veins and arteries began to take shape. Mina watched from her position, her head on her mate's shoulder, as Izuku's arm slowly began to resemble an arm instead of gore held together by thought alone. There were some sounds of flesh melding, something she had gotten used to with Izuku. Soon enough, the shape of an arm was obvious, and the dense muscles began to string and layer together. They looked like red cables bundled up as flesh began to grow over the exposed muscles and veins. Just like that, Izuku's arm was back to how it was. Mina grabbed his newly formed hand and Izuku let her play with it. She ran her fingers along his smooth skin and pouted at him. "It's not fair, your skin is so nice." Izuku smiled at her and bumped his head with hers gently. "I like your skin just how it is." He yawned and showed off his sharp white teeth. The focus and regeneration of his arm took a lot out of him. He felt Mina's hands pull his head down to his lap and he lay there looking up at her. She smiled down at him and kissed his forehead. "Get some sleep, you look like you need it." She gently brushed his hair in the way she knew he liked and slowly but surely, his eyes drooped. Namori in the driver's seat smiled to herself as she heard the interaction between the two. She felt at peace knowing her son would be well taken care of by Mina. Sure, she knew he could take care of himself, but Mina gave him the mental stability he probably forgot about most of the time. She could see from the beginning of the school year when Izuku first came into their lives how much more unhinged he was compared to now with friends guiding him in the right direction. She was so happy her son was happy too. They pulled up to the front of the dorms and they got out. Izuku was woken up by his mate's gentle shaking. He stirred awake and groggily followed Mina pulling his arm. He still wanted to sleep, so he followed his Mina without question to the scent of his room. He was gently guided to the dense mattress and he didn't fight it as he laid down once again. Mina was about to leave his side when his hand latched onto hers and she was pulled into the bed as well. With a quiet yelp of surprise, Mina was being cuddled by a sleepy Izuku. His chin rested on top of her head and his arms wrapped possessively around her as he snored softly. "Oh well, looks like there's nothing I can do," she whispered to herself as she decided to take a nap herself after the day's excitement. She smiled as she burrowed tighter into Izuku's chest. Toshi watched Kane trot from Izuku's room alone. He waited for Mina to come out since he could tell Izuku was practically sleepwalking. He wanted to know what had happened. He could tell immediately when they walked through the door that something had happened with Izuku's different shirt and his sleepy state. His best friend slept a lot, but he only slept deeply when he was tired and used a lot of energy. Why would his good friend use lots of energy on their little date? When Mina didn't come out of Izuku's room, he shook his head. He looked to Kane, who stretched out in the common room to take a nap himself. "You wouldn't know what happened." Kane perked up and looked at Toshi. He got up and began to growl and leap around until he slammed his front paw on the ground and then sat looking proud, his tail wagging at whatever that was. Toshi could only stare as Kane tried to charade what had happened today, but he failed to understand what he tried to explain. Toshi nodded. "I see, thank you." He did not see but thanked the more intelligent dog than he thought. Kane barked at him and laid down once again. "Where is Kota when you need him?" he said to himself and looked around in hopes of seeing the animal-speaking prince. He chose to let it be and continued to stroke the Bengal cat on his lap. Izuku felt a tapping sensation on his nose and groggily opened his eyes to see Mina in his arms and looking up at him. "Zu, I'm hungry. Can you please let me go?" she asked pleadingly with her dark golden eyes as wide as she could open them. He buried his face into her hair and held her tighter just for a moment longer before letting her go. She giggled at his affectionate actions. She stretched for a moment and then helped Izuku get up while brushing his hair into a semblance of being neat. "Time is it?" He looked out the window to see the sun just now beginning to lower. There were still a few hours until the sunset. "Come on, I know you're just as if not more hungry than me." She pulled his hand to the door. He smiled at her and followed her while holding her hand. They walked into the common room with the regular amount of commotion, having 20 teens living under the same roof. Kachan was the first one to spot the pair and crossed his arms at them. That got everyone's attention and turned to see what he was looking at to see the two mates. Well, look what the cat dragged in. Wanna fill us in on that?" He pointed at the TV, which was showing a news segment of Izuku taunting Mirko as a villain was being cuffed and seen by medical personnel. Izuku squinted for a moment at the TV. "Oh, well, it started when Mina got lost." "Why are you saying it like it was my fault?" Mina interrupted and looked incredulous. The feral boy shook his head. "It's not your fault, it was Kane's." The dog whimpered and Izuku quickly added, "But it was a good thing." The mutt barked jovial and wagged his tail. He turned back to his meal of something the other packmates fed him. "How is getting attacked by a Yakuza mob boss a good thing?" Toshi admonished his best friend. "So there was this little girl. Apparently the bird mask villain was doing bad things to her, and I cut his hand off while Mina took her to the police," he said, beaming at his explanation. The room erupted in questions and Mina kissed his cheek and let him explain while she made food for the two of them. Kachan stepped forward and made a small pop with his quirk to stop the questions and wolf whistles thrown at his old friend. When it was quiet again, Kachan pointed at Izuku. Explain better. Yay. The guy doesn't even have a bird mask, Kaminari added as he pointed at the TV. Izuku's eyes lit up at remembering. He pulled his shirt up and the same bird mask emerged. Because I took it, he said, holding it up in pride. Iida was about to lecture Izuku about taking from a villain but paused and let the feral boy who saved his brother's hero career do what he wanted as long as it was harmless. He cleared his throat and motioned to Izuku. Can you please explain what happened from start to finish? Many others nodded in agreement at Iida's question. Izuku beamed at all of his pack and began using his legendary storytelling skills. After I got that paperwork done with Gang, Mina and me went around the city. We ate stuff and Mina wanted some pastries but Kane found a little girl hiding in an alleyway. The villain came and tried to take her so Mina ran with the girl while I fought the bird villain with Kane. We were great, Kane barked in agreement. What's with your arm? Kirishima pointed at the TV where it was clear to see Izuku's amalgamation of an arm. I'm getting to it, anyways. The villain touched me with his hand and his quirk activated like how Chako's or Shigigig's quirks work, except he made whatever he touched change. Kinda like Rozu's quirk but with his hands. My arm exploded but I put it back together, kinda. After that, I cut one of his hands off and then I beat him. Then Mikamiko came and that's about it, he nodded. Everyone was quiet for a moment before Yaoyorozu asked, what do you mean, like my quirk? Izuku hummed in thought. He touched stuff and it changed. The walls and floors of the alleyway turned into spears and he healed himself. I think it's some kind of matter manipulation quirk. Jiru, playing with her earlobes, asked. That's why you slept most of the day away? 'Cause you got hurt so much? The feral boy shrugged a bit. Kinda, it was just the arm that took a lot out of me. It was like a jigsaw puzzle Toshi made me work on at the camp but I just mashed parts together until it worked. That doesn't sound healthy. Shoji pointed out. Bone to bone, blood in veins. Izuku waved the concerns away. It's like tying your shoes. At some point, you stop thinking about it and just do it. Toshi narrowed his eyes at his friend with a smirk. Do you even know how to tie shoes? Izuku's eyes drifted away from Toshi and didn't answer. He sniffled once and said. No one has ever taught me. A large tear grew at the corner of his eye. No, that shit won't work on me, Toshi said dryly. His mood shifted in an instant. You're no fun. The tear and runny nose were nowhere to be seen. Are you guys bullying my mate? Mina said from the kitchen. Obviously, Kachan said with a snort. Mina mock glared at the blonde and pulled Izuku to the kitchen where there was a small mound of sandwiches for Izuku and her. She eyed the obvious trophy in his hands but didn't question it too much. They sat together and ate while the pack switched from the news to an old cartoon. It was a peaceful night after the panic and battle earlier that day. The next day, Izuku got a phone call from Gang. He groggily answered while Mina hid her face under Izuku's pillow at the noise. Pup, did I wake you? Yes. Izuku mumbled, still half asleep. Gang chuckled heartily. Apologies, but we need to meet up with another hero who was investigating the villain you took down yesterday. He wants to ask you a few questions about him. MK, where should I go? To you or somewhere else? Meet me at the address I've sent you. You can manage that, right? Izuku paused and nodded. Probably, he said honestly. Gang chuckled again. All right, see you after school. School? What day is it? Mina let out a wordless groan at the reminder of school as Izuku looked around in search of a calendar that didn't exist in his room, nor did he know what month it was or which week in the month. He could hear the smile on Gang's face through the phone as he said his farewells. Izuku looked at the address his mentor sent him and wondered how he was supposed to do the thing to allow him to find it on a map. He turned to Mina, who was already reaching for his phone. She fluidly transferred the address to the map application he used and handed it back to him. He kissed her forehead in thanks. She laughed softly at his affection and got up with him to get ready for another day of school. The school day ended and Izuku followed the map indicator to a train and then he walked for a bit until he stopped in front of a nondescript building. He shrugged and opened the door to see Gang chatting with a man who had a centipede as a head. They turned to him at the same time and Izuku beamed at his mentor and walked in. Hey, Gang. Izuku greeted happily. He quickly walked to his mentor and the centipede man behind the front desk. Hello. I'm Izuku. He introduced himself to the stranger. He tilted his head to the side to get a good look at the person before him and asked, "Are you one really big centipede in clothes or a person with a centipede quirk?" Gang bopped him on the head with a slight reproach frown. "That's rude, Izuku." The man chuckled with a slight hissing undertone and waved Gang Orca's concerns away. "My name is Centipeder and it's the latter of the two. It's very nice to meet you, young man." Izuku rubbed where he was bopped and looked at Gang in outrage. "How was that rude? I was just asking. It would have been rude if I asked him." "I don't know, what would be rude to ask you?" He turned to the centipede man. Centipeder stroked his chin in thought and proposed. "If I came out of an egg, possibly?" He shrugged. Izuku paused and looked at him. "Did you?" He dodged the large bopping hand of Gang and hid behind Centipeder in a flash. He peeked out behind the man and pointed at Gang. "Mina said hitting kids is child abuse and that's illegal." Gang scoffed and laughed at the same time. "You're hardly a kid, pup. If that's illegal, then what happens when a kid hits another kid?" He asked, knowing it would stump Izuku's lack of knowledge in that area. True to what Gang Orca thought, the question made Izuku scrunch his nose in thought. "It's fine? Because it's like pups fighting and it's to practice hunting, right?" He looked between the two people who should know this knowledge. Gang chuffed a laugh. "Close enough, but if you do see kids fighting, make sure to break it up. We'll talk about it later. For now, we have a meeting to get to. It's nice to meet you, Centipeder." He waved Izuku to follow. "It was pleasant to make both your acquaintance as well." He bowed slightly. Izuku scurried after Gang and waved at Centipeder. "Who are we meeting with?" Gang knocked on a door and he opened it to see a blue-skinned woman tied to a standing table in way too revealing clothes laughing uncontrollably as a well-dressed man in glasses watched on stoically. Izuku didn't know what to do other than watch on in slight discomfort at the scene before him. He tugged on his mentor's sleeve. "Hey, Gang. Is this one of those sex scandal things? Should we do something?" Gang looked between Izuku and the scene before them, unsure what to do himself. I'm kinda thirsty. Why don't you ask Centipeder if he has some water for me, please?" He gently nudged the young susceptible man away from the lunacy. Izuku nodded and trotted away as the door shut. He rounded the corner and found Centipeder sitting behind the front desk going through some paperwork. "Centipeder? Do you have some water?" Gang said he was thirsty. Centipeder looked up from the desk and tilted his head between the boys shuffling on his feet and the door where he came from. "Of course, one moment." He opened a small refrigerator and grabbed a water bottle before handing it to the young man. "Thanks, Centi." He quickly made his way back to the door and paused. He pressed his ear to the door and heard nothing before he hesitantly opened it. He found Gang talking to the well-dressed man while the woman recovered on a chair to the side, no longer tied to the table. Izuku took a wide berth between the man and the table to get next to Gang and give him the water. He suspiciously eyed the tall lanky man. "Thank you, Izuku. This is Sir Night-Eye." "Night-Eye, this Izuku Kayama, also known as Hunter." Gang took the water bottle and introduced the two men staring intently at each other. Night-Eye was the first to hold out a hand to shake. "I'm told you were the one who fought and apprehended Overhaul." Izuku looked at the hand and back at the woman who had dried tear stains on her face for laughing too hard. "Do you do sex scandal things to Centipeder too?" He tentatively shook hands with the man. "Hey." Night-Eye's mouth quirked up a minuscule amount before he cleared his throat and pushed his glasses up with his other hand. "It's not a sex scandal thing. It's a way to ensure people can remember under my employ to smile and laugh. Bubble Girl over there just needed a reminder. Centipeder does a good job making people laugh," he said as he released Izuku's hand. "He said your name was Hunter. How did you come to choose such a moniker?" Izuku shrugged. "I'm a really good hunter. I can hunt anything, anywhere," he said proudly. Night-Eye hummed. "What about a human?" "Kinda. I mean, I've never killed and eaten a human, but I've tracked one down before and stopped him from being a criminal." He shrugged. "I mean, I could have killed a person before if they had an animal transformation quirk and I hunted them without knowing. At that point, who's to know?" He shrugged once again. The two adults were quiet for a moment and exchanged glances before looking at Izuku once more. "Right. Overhaul was a man I was investigating as he was the head of a Yakuza gang we suspected of producing a drug known as Trigger. I asked for a meeting with you, through your mentor, since you fought him, and I wished to ask what he said to you during the altercation. He motioned to the chairs as he made his way to his desk. Gang sat down before Izuku. Don't worry, pup. This brand of chair is very sturdy. He patted the seat beside him. The feral boy trusted his mentor and sat on the chair before shifting his weight to test it. To his satisfaction, he didn't even make a noise. Comfy. What's a Yakuza gang? Sir leaned back slightly and began to explain. It's understandable for you not to know. They're a criminal organization from before quirks came to be. There are fewer of them now, but a group of thugs under a leader is just another gang no matter what they call themselves. Izuku nodded along with the explanation. Okay. He shrugged and told him about his interaction with Overhaul. Well, Kane found Eri hiding from Overhaul. She was hurt and had clothes they gave people that went into the hospital. Anyways, Overhaul came around the corner of the alleyway and said something about needing a new supplier before we fought. I don't know what that means. Then he wanted Eri, but my mate took her to safety and we fought. He was super angry and kept saying I was sick or a sickness, which doesn't make sense since I can't get sick, so he tried to kill me. He wasn't very good at it, he said smugly. Sir looked at him with a straight face. To me, it seems you were lucky. You could have easily died in that alleyway. One touch from him and you would have been a smear on the wall. Reckless. He shook his head at the arrogance of the young man. Izuku scoffed at him. He did touch me and my arm exploded. He tried to explode the rest of my body, but I was better. And I grew my arm back and he didn't. That shows that I'm better, he said with his arms crossed. Gang Orca sat back to watch the interaction between the two. He would step in if something got out of hand, but he was sure Izuku wouldn't hurt anyone. Seriously. He did wonder why Sir Night-Eye was provoking Izuku though, but he let it be since Midnight had asked him to give Izuku real-world experience that he was definitely lacking. I did have a plan. Mina took Eri away while I stopped Birdman. When I thought of others getting in Mina's way, I sent Kane to help her. Izuku said loudly, almost getting off his chair. Sir scoffed, still seated in a picture-perfect posture. Half-baked at most. Why do you call him Birdman? He said with narrowed eyes. Izuku froze for a brief moment and looked around. Because he had a bird mask but it was destroyed or something. He forcibly sucked in the sweat trying to trickle down his forehead. Like you could have stopped him. Hey, I bet I could even beat you too. With no eyes even. He quickly changed the conversation from his rightfully gained trophy. Sir stared at him with his hands arched before his face. His eyes glowed purple for a moment and then he jerked backward as he threw projectiles at Izuku in a panicked motion. One nailed him in the forehead and Izuku tipped backwards. Gang jumped to his feet and threw the desk between Sir and them at the attacking hero. What is the meaning of this? Gang roared in anger at seeing his intern getting attacked in such a way. That hurt. Izuku clutched his forehead where blood dribbled and an imprint of the dense seal that was thrown. He glared at Sir who was looking at him with a pale face and sweat drenching his face. He sniffed the air and he caught the scent of pure animalistic terror coming from the hero. Why did you do that? And why do you smell scared? Gang, this guy is weird and not the normal weird too. He did grow bone plates over his skin just in case. He also snatched the thing that was thrown at him because it looked neat. I saw what you did, Sir said, his arm posed to throw more seals at Izuku. Step back, Gang Orca, you do not know what he is capable of. His eyes never left Izuku, crouched down to pounce at a moment's notice. It's mine now. You threw it at me, that means it's mine now. Kachan said so. It's the rules. He clutched at his newest toy, which was a hero's support weapon. Gang Orca stepped between the two and shouted. Sir Night-Eye, explain yourself. Why did you attack my student? I used my quirk on him and saw what he did to us. He devoured us both when I tried to fight him. He shivered as he spoke. It's only a matter of moments now. I've never been wrong with my future sight. Gang paused and looked at Izuku and he looked back at him. I ain't gonna eat anyone. I saw it. Sir jabbed a finger at Izuku. Well, I thought of it as a strategy but I wasn't actually gonna do it. I like Gang. He's like an uncle. I guess. I don't know what uncles do. Izuku said honestly. Gang's chest warmed at hearing Izuku call him an uncle but focused on the situation at hand. Future seeing quirks have always been fickle things, are you sure you saw correctly? He waved to Izuku, who was crouched threateningly but not currently devouring either of them. Oracle quirks are so complicated. Is yours the most likely to happen? Or what I'm thinking at the time? Or is it one of those that it's gonna happen no matter what and I end up eating you too? I don't wanna eat you, gang. Izuku said, tearing up and sniffling at losing the big hero. Gang rubbed his snout and got close to Izuku for a hug. You aren't going to eat me. You might be right about the theory of what you were currently thinking as he activated his quirk. My quirk has never been wrong, Sir said, still not moving from his position. Everyone turned to see a face emerging from the door. Sir quickly shouted at him. Lemillion, help me apprehend Izuku Kayama, he ordered. Izuku and Gang Orca stood up from their position. Mito, Cat Eye is going crazy, he pointed at Sir Night-Eye. Mirio for his part looked at each party and then disappeared for a moment before reappearing, walking through the door with Centipeder and the woman who was tied to the table earlier. So, let's all take a deep breath and calm down. Mirio led by example and took a big breath. He nodded approvingly at Izuku, who copied him and then released the breath. Now, what's going on? After an explanation from Gang Orca and a calming Sir Night-Eye, tension lowered. Izuku still kept his bone plates up and kept an eye on the lanky man. We'll see ourselves out, Gang said in a clipped tone. The feral boy nodded and narrowed his eyes at the hero who attacked him. And for your information, I didn't want to eat you. You look like you taste bad. With that last remark, Izuku left with Gang pushing him out the door. And, I'm going to tell everyone about your sex scandal thing. Everyone heard before the door closed. 15 or so minutes later, Izuku and Gang Orca sat on the patio of a restaurant eating their meals. They haven't spoken much after the mess that was meeting with Sir Night-Eye. Well, it could have been worse. Granted, it was his fault to begin with, Gang said. Izuku nodded fervently with his mouth full of a cheeseburger. He chewed quickly and swallowed before speaking. Yay, he attacked first, and he can't attack someone just because he thinks something is going to happen. You need proof before it happens. Otherwise, anyone with an oracle quirk could point at someone and say they could do something bad before it even happens. He ranted and snatched up another burger to eat. At least I got a neat thing. He pulled out the dense weight and set it on the table. Gang picked it up and was surprised by the weight. He threw this at you. It weighs at least 5 kilograms. It hurt a lot, it cracked my skull. He rubbed at where the impact was before he healed it. The large hero shook his head and set down Izuku's newest toy. I'll be sure to submit a complaint about this. I'm sorry, Izuku. I would have never taken you there if I knew Sir was so unpredictable. But why would his quirk act in such a way? Izuku shrugged Gang's apology away. He never blamed the orca. Probably because I was thinking of strategies to take him down and he used his quirk at the moment I thought of that plan. I wouldn't ever do that to you, Gang. But it still came up. He unwrapped another burger before devouring it like a starving man. Gang leaned forward to take a burger for himself and asked, what kind of strategies did you think of? He waved at Izuku with his burger. He finished chewing and began. Grappling was first. Using as many tendrils to stop Cat Eye. If he had some way to keep his distance, then I would have tried a new technique. I call it ribbon net. I copied it from a ribbon worm that can shoot out a net from its mouth to capture prey and eat it. It had a mild paralytic poison that I switched for the poison I made, which does the same but better. If those didn't work, then overwhelming force, which included a lethal approach in eating everything or infecting everything with my cells. He chomped into his burger and hummed in delight at its taste. Gang was already getting used to his charge's proclivities, so he wasn't too worried about what he had said, but he was curious about the last statement. What do you mean? Infect everything with your cells? Izuku finished the burger he was working on. Well, my cells are my quirk. Every cell follows my command. If I tell a single cell to consume and replicate, then there's nothing that will stop it until the entire foreign organism is consumed and taken over by my cells. Then I could just assimilate. Or tell the new cells to become something new. Like reproducing asexually but faster and much better. Or cloning. Izuku shrugged. Like those Nomu, I can make them but way better. But I'm not a bad guy, I'm a hero. Gang leaned back and huffed out a breath at the idea of Izuku becoming a biological apocalypse. Well, good thing you're such a good pup. He ruffled his hair roughly and laughed. Not a pup. Izuku whined but didn't stop the large hand from rubbing his head affectionately. Gang Orca made sure Izuku was dropped off at the dorms before he headed to his agency to finish his work before going home himself. With a hug goodbye, Izuku left Gang at the gates of the school and went to find his pack to see what they were doing. Izuku strolled in and was about to greet his packmates when they all quieted. What? Izuku paused mid-step at everyone's stares. They weren't bad stares but closer to pitying stares. What happened? It's Kaminari. Shiro spoke first, crying faux tears for the fate of his friend. Is he okay? Izuku asked, worried for his packmate. He sniffed the air and caught the scent of the electric user and lamb. His eyes focused and found the smell of his favorite snacks, or what remained of them. All his favorite snack sticks were eaten and the wrappers were placed in the now empty box. Izu, it's fine. We can get you more. Mina tried to placate her mate and keep him from killing their packmate. Izuku's head snapped up and shifted into his hunter's form. He began to sniff the air in search of the one who took his favorite snacks. Izuku, no. Mina leapt on his back to stop him, but the weight was nothing to a determined hunter. Help! Mina cried out to her classmates who watched on in panic. Sato leapt to his feet and tried to tie his legs up with his bulk, but it was impossible, so he clung to one leg to slow him down. Hiroshima, seeing Sato's plan, grabbed the other leg. Izuku kept tracking Kaminari. Shiro began to wrap his body in tape, including Mina, who was latched to his back, and the two on his legs. Without being able to move and the unwillingness to hurt his packmates, he fell tied like a mummy. He struggled and bit at the tape, but it was fruitless. Kane! Izuku roared out and shook the dorms with his voice. Find him! Kane, seated to the side and watching his pack leader lose purposely in confusion, leapt to his paws to follow his command. Kota leapt in front of him and began to talk him down. Kane liked Kota. He was nice to talk to, but his pack leader gave him an order, so he headbutted Kutra in the chest and knocked him on his butt, and ran off with the scent of Kaminari, the snack thief, in front of him. Shit, we forgot about Kane. He's so dead, Shiro said, clutching his head in dread for his friend. Mina felt Izuku shrink in size under her and looked at him. He was pouting, so she hugged him tighter. There wasn't much else she could do, taped to his back, not that she was complaining. It's okay, Zu. We'll get you more of your snacks. Izuku felt Sato pat his left leg. We'll get you so many more, he said, muffled under the tape. Totally, Hiroshima said from his right leg. From the distance, everyone in the dorms heard a long howl before they heard a shriek of panic. Everyone but Izuku bowed their head to pay their respects to a fallen pack member. Kaminari, the lamb thief, would not be forgotten. With Kane's howl, Izuku found where to go. His taped body was still being held by his mate on his back, with Sato and Kirishima on his legs. That didn't stop him from sprouting 4 large spider legs from his sides that ripped through the tape. There were a few horrified shrieks from his packmates, but Izuku paid them no mind. He began to scuttle out of the dorms to find the thief. Toshi, Izuku's first and best friend, watched as the biological horror that was the feral boy he befriended scuttle out of the dorms like a horror movie. While he wasn't afraid of spiders, the way they ran on too many legs gave him the chills, so he wisely kept out of this one and instead watched with his phone recording as Izuku hunted Kaminari for eating his favorite snacks. Izu, no. His mate hugged him tighter but knew it was a lost cause. She paused and poked him with one of her horns. Hey, Zu, what if I ate them? Izuku didn't pause in his scuttle as he answered. I already told you, you can have whatever is mine. You're my mate. He couldn't turn to look at her but gently nudged his head back against her. Even tied to his back due to one of her packmate's quirks and unable to move much, he still made her blush with his affectionate words. That's so adorable, a muffled voice was said at Izuku's left leg. Mina blushed even more, forgetting she wasn't the only passenger. It didn't take long for Izuku's hunt to come to an end, with Kaminari kicking futility as he was dragged behind Izuku, with Kane trotting happily beside them at his successful task. Kaminari pleaded for mercy, but Izuku gave him none as he was dragged across the UA grounds in the dimming light of sunset. What in God's name is that? Kaibara-sen asked out loud. Quickly, Tetsutsu joined him at the window in the kitchen. Is that a Nomu? He paused and then added. And a dog. Kendo got up from the couch to see what the two were talking about, and sure enough something was traveling through their stretch of backyard at the 1B dorms. I think that's Kaminari Denki from 1A being dragged behind, whatever that is. I believe that is Izuku Kayama, Shinshida said behind them all. Tetsutsu jumped at his sudden appearance. Bro, you're way too big to be that quiet. Are you sure? Kendo asked Shinshida. He adjusted his glasses. Almost positive. My nose is quite good and Sir Izuku masks his scent very well, but that gives it away on itself. Yo, Izuku, Ken shouted out. Kendo felt some kind of dread and wanted to slap Ken for getting Izuku's attention as he was dragging Kaminari. The dog and spider thing that was Izuku stopped in their tracks and the dog turned in their direction. That weird thing that happens when an animal looks into a light source and it's reflected by their eyes happened, but it was worse when a large tentacle extended from whoever was dragging Kaminari and then the tentacle bloomed like a flower from hell. It split down the tip in a dozen directions to become a cone of flesh with eyes sprouting at the tips. If they stood next to the aberration of flesh that was that cone, they could probably get swallowed by it like a horror movie. No one moved closer. What the fuck? Ken said softly and slowly closed the glass back door as if that would stop whatever that was. Bad words. A voice came from the creature a few hundred feet away. The voice came from the flesh cone aimed at them. With that, who they presume was Izuku kept going as the cone was closed and disappeared. The four stood there quietly as who they hoped was Izuku disappeared in the direction of the 1A dorms. After a long moment, Tetsutsu asked a valid question. Was that their dog? Do you think we could get a pet for the dorm? Kaminari pressed his forehead against the floor of the dorms in front of his displeased pack leader. Like he was asking for forgiveness from the Emperor of Japan, he continuously bowed in front of Izuku, who managed to stand up even with all the weight of Mina, Sato, and Kirishima still taped to him. It was a ridiculous scene for anyone who would have walked into the dorms at that moment. Izuku stood over Kaminari as he explained his mistake and how he would fix it, as Izuku himself looked like a mummy half done. Kane sat at his side with his chest out and head held high in an oddly regal manner. I promise it won't happen again. Kaminari pleaded once more, his head still on the floor. Everyone in the dorms watched on in silence for many reasons. Some had warned him not to eat his snacks and he waved the concerns off. Others knew something like this would have happened and let Kaminari dig his own grave. While a few just liked the drama and wanted to see the outcome, most especially Toshi, who was recording the whole interaction with glee. Izuku, with hands tied down by Siro's tape, used a tendril to point at Kaminari. You shall hunt a lamb as payment and bring it to me. Kaminari's head shot up with wide eyes. What? Kachan cackled. Yes, enjoying the whole thing. Jiro smirked and said to her phone. Where is the nearest lamb? Izuku. No, Yaoyorozu exclaimed at the same time. Equivalent exchange, it is only right, Tokiyami said with a faux sage's wisdom. Do you think he'll share the lamb? Dark Shadow whispered to his brother. Tokiyami gave him a look that could convey hope. Hey, Zu, wouldn't it be better just for him to get you a new box of lamb sticks? Asked Mina, whose head was on Izuku's shoulder, still taped to his back. It'll probably be faster. Izuku paused and looked unsure. He looked to Kaminari and his tendril split to show 2 fingers in front of him. 2 boxes. Kaminari wept tears of relief and shot a thankful look in Mina's direction. I'll do it, he said, bowing, and when he looked up, Mina was giving him a grin and mouthed the words, you owe me, at him. He realized he got off the hook and was immediately caught in another. With that done, Izuku nodded at having resolved the issue of the snack thief. Good, now the tape. He looked down at his body. It took a handful of people to help Izuku get out of the multiple layers of tape. Sato and Kirishima flopped off his legs in relief, with Mina being the last to be freed. She still clung to Izuku even afterward like a baby possum to its mother. Her mate was more than content to have her close. With all the tape balled up, Izuku bounced it from hand to hand before sticking it to the wall. It stayed there and he left it where it was with a shrug. He sat with his packmates with a small strip of tape from Siro. He never took a good look at it before, but now that he looked closely at it, it reminded him of spider silk. He might be able to mimic Siro's quirk if he wanted. Oh, Izuku exclaimed, surprising everyone. They all looked at him and he looked at each one of them in thought. You all right there, bud? Shiro asked. He was aware of Izuku's examination of his tape and was ready for any questions he had, but he wasn't ready for the sudden exclamation. Izuku pointed at his best friend. You forgot to remind me. As he continued to eye each of his packmates. There too many things, which one? He groaned out, already knowing Izuku planning something or remembered a past plan. To mimic quirks. Shiro's tape looked a lot like Spider's silk and I thought I could replicate it when I remembered I never tried to mimic you guys' quirks. Some obviously won't work like Yami's or Roki's. He motioned to the two quiet boys. And I don't like the idea of messing with my brain, so not yours or Kota's. Yaoyorozu looked interested, but it would be feasible to duplicate quirks on yourself. Like Monoma from 1B but permanent, or as permanent as you like. Yep, like that Scully from 1B. He showed by example by covering his arm in similar scales to Hiryu Rin. Kachan raised his hand in a motion to stop Izuku from continuing. Don't call people scalies, it's weird. Everyone turned to him with raised eyebrows except Izuku, who looked confused. And no, there were some real weirdos in my middle school. I learned just from hearing their interests. He said the final part while cringing. Why? What does that mean? Izuku asked. Mina, who had yet to let go of Izuku's back, hugged his head and brushed his hair. Hush, you don't need to know. I won't let you learn such sacrilegious things. Then you won't mind if we look around your room or on your phone, will you? Kaminari said, leaning forward and staring at Kachan with a grin. Iida interrupted Kachan from blasting Kaminari for such an insinuation. Back to the original topic. Izuku, you were saying. Right, so it's simple to copy animals because it's basic biology. Quirks are harder to copy because there's a connection between an organ and the brain that wouldn't be feasible. Like Ruzo's quirk, I can copy her skin cells, but I wouldn't have that special connection between it and my mind to do anything with it. Unless I dissected her to learn. He stopped again, the horrified look everyone gave him. But, I won't do that, because she's my pack mate, it was just an example. He said now sheepishly. After a moment of quiet where everyone reoriented themselves from that and Mina gave Izuku an understanding squeeze, Iida motioned him to continue. He was interested in Izuku's potential at copying quirks. I imagine some quirks would be possible, such as Mina's or Shiro's as you said earlier. Yes, but there's one quirk I want to copy the most. Everyone looked interested to see who would Izuku want to copy. Hagu Hakugu Toru. He fumbled over trying to say her name like a child and pointed at the invisible girl. Me, Hagakuri, she exclaimed, pointed at herself. Toshi gave Izuku an unimpressed look. Really, you couldn't say Hagakuri? Is that why you are always giving people nicknames? He pointed with an accusatory finger at his best friend. Izuku ducked his head and blushed at finally getting caught. It's hard, he mumbled. Once again, everyone was reminded of Izuku's past. While he did have the mind of a savant in biological studies and an innate instinct for fighting, he wasn't raised with others who learned how to say more difficult words or names. He was self-taught all his life, and Toshi was harshly reminded of that by the multiple glares he received. Toshi accepted the glares and winced at being so insensitive. Sorry, Izuku, didn't mean to make fun of you like that, he said earnestly. I don't mind, just embarrassed you caught me is all. He waved it off while feeling Mina's tight arms around him in a show of comfort. The invisible girl, seeing his mood drop, quickly said, You can call Toru, I don't mind if it's easier. The rest of the class added their reassurance of him calling them whatever was easiest. Izuku smiled gratefully to all of them and continued with his idea. At first, Hagakuri was unsure of the idea, mostly because of her insecurity about having such a basic quirk, and then Izuku mimicked it, she would be forgotten or something the like. Izuku was quick to fix that outlook. But I won't be able to control the light like you've been able to. I'll just mimic the part where you're always invisible. I could try to do what you did with bending the light, but I'd probably just try to reflect it like a mirror. I'm just copying one part of your quirk. Izuku finished with a beaming smile. It didn't take much more after that for her to give him a lock of hair so he could study it. His mate grumbled about taking another girl's hair, but it was all in good nature. Mina still hadn't let go of Izuku's back and was still comfortably looking over his shoulder while playing on her phone with her arms around him. Izuku drowned out the rest of the world as he worked on examining the invisible hair from all angles. He had tendrils consume one strand and break it down one cell at a time to see what made Toru invisible. An hour or so later, Izuku smiled triumphantly at his hand or where it should be as it was invisible. It was odd to see where the invisibility ends and normal skin begins, but all he cared about was mimicking Toru's passive part of her quirk. While he couldn't apply the invisible cells to his skin since that would require the epidermis, or the top layer of skin, to change into a copy of Toru's skin when he used it, which would use way too much energy to transform from one to another when he wanted to cloak himself. So what he did instead was develop scales that had the properties of Toru's quirk already on top of them, so he could just grow the specific scales and then he was invisible. He grinned happily as he stared at his hand, which was not visible. His smile faded when he turned the hand and he saw problems. Two issues cropped up. First and foremost, it wasn't the same invisibility that Toru had. It was closer to say light imperfectly bent around the scales. When he moved his hand, he could see something distorted. Almost an outline of his hand appeared, but it was hard to tell. It was enough to tell something was wrong if he used it in a hunt. The second issue, he could hear the scales he used when he moved his fingers. They were thick and used mostly for protecting against blade and impact. They weren't meant to be used for stealth. If he covered his whole body in the scales, every time he moved it would give away his position. They were fine when he was battling against a foe. Sound would be the last thing on anyone's mind when he fought, but while hunting, a single sound could give away his position to his prey. He pursed his lips in thought and focused on the biggest issue, the scales. Maybe if he switched them to a different style it would resolve both issues. With that, he nodded and made to get up, but stopped when he felt Mina's arms around him tighten in her grumble. He looked over his shoulder to see her sleeping soundly on him. He smiled at her, but he needed to get his book about animal biology to see if there was anything he could replace the scales he was using. So, he extended a tendril with a pair of stubby legs and controlled it to run to his room while a leash of skin was still connected to it. Thankfully his room was on the first floor. Sato came out of the bathroom on the main floor and stopped right outside of it. He stared at the umbilical cord leading from the common room and ended on a small thing on legs in front of Izuku's room. It was jumping futility to open his door. It stopped and its legs changed into more frog-like. When it leapt again it caught the door handle. It dangled there and poked it with a key until it managed to unlock the door. It opened the door and ran inside. Sato couldn't stop his curiosity and peeked inside to see the thing drag a book one slow step at a time. He picked up the book and the thing dangled from it, kicking its legs futility. Izuku gave Sato a grateful smile as he handed him the book he was trying to retrieve. He gave Izuku a smile in return and went back to his spot in the common room. The feral boy immediately opened the book and searched for anything he could use for a medium to cover with invisibility and then his body. He found many possibilities but none that fit the requirements. That was until he flipped from the reptile section to the sea life section. Izuku already knew most fish had scales and he found one perfect mix of protection and stealth. Shark scales are adapted to be used in the water to decrease drag, but Izuku could use them just fine out of the water. Standard shark scales usually have grooves to provide ways to cut through the water without the shark losing speed, but Izuku didn't need the grooves, so he removed them and made the scales slightly larger, just under the size of a fingernail. With success, his hand was invisible once again, and the distortion of moving was lesser. He shifted the scales to see if he could fix that issue, but the movement distortion didn't change much. He pursed his lips but accepted it wouldn't be perfect like Toru's invisibility. As for the noise, he moved his digits with little to no noise. He grinned happily at the successful experiment. The next day, after getting his mate to bed without waking her, Izuku found himself back with Gang Orca. Izuku was more than excited to show off his newest ability to his mentor. "Hey, Gang, should we, I don't know, have another spar to make sure I'm as good as I was before?" Izuku said way too innocently. Gang looked down at the pup and eyed him. He could tell he wanted to show him something he came up with but was doing it in a roundabout manner that seemed extremely adorable to the big man. He played into whatever Izuku had planned. "Yes, that makes sense. Let's go for a few bouts." He smiled as Izuku lit up like a Christmas tree. He bounded inside the sparring excitedly. "All right, pup, What did you want to show me? Izuku grinned mischievously and extended his hand. Scales grew for a second before his arm disappeared in a distortion of bending light. It traveled up his arm and covered his body including his quirk clothes he was grateful worked with his scales. Finally, his head was covered with scales, and his hair was pulled back with a thin dome of bone with the invisible scales already covering it. Gang could still see Izuku from the distortions of light, but when he stopped moving, he disappeared. Gang Orca began to get nervous at losing sight of a very dangerous predator. Yes, he knew Izuku wouldn't hurt him, but his instincts didn't give him an opinion. Pup, that's amazing, how do you manage that? He looked around to see if he could catch a distortion of light, but nothing. He flinched when a finger poked his cheek. The scales pulled back from his face with a grin showing. I mimicked the cells on Toru to get her invisibility. He stepped back to show him what he made. I put them on scales to make it easier to cover myself. I didn't want to replace my epidermis every time I wanted to cloak myself. It doesn't work perfectly, but if I don't move quickly or at all, I'm virtually invisible. He showed the distortion by waving his arm to exemplify the light distortion. Gang looked at his intern and just ruffled his hair. That's terrifying, pup, it's great. Izuku grinned happily as he accepted the hair ruffling. You called your other forms other things, right? Like Echo Hunter, what about this? Izuku grinned up at him with his big hand on his head still. Cloaked Hunter. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and now we will see you in the next video.